Chapter 1. No. You can't eat that. Becca Jones grinned at her best friend, Emily Callahan. Emily was glowing with pregnancy and irritation as she scowled into a bowl of chocolate chip cookie dough. What do you mean I can't eat it? I'm pregnant. I should be able to eat anything I want, and I want to eat this now. Not if you don't want to give you and your little one salmonella poisoning, Becca retorted calmly. You're going to have to bake it first. But you know what's going to happen when I bake it. It will burn. Oh, stop. You've been practicing for months now. Your success rate is up to at least 50%. When Emily stared her down and reached a finger out for a scoop of the cookie dough, Becca whipped out her wooden spoon and smacked the back of her hand. For a moment, she felt just like her Granny Jones. Emily screwed up her face and stuck out her tongue. You're getting to be as bad as Brody. Such a little mother hen. To her horror, Becca felt tears rush to her eyes as her face heated in shame. What? No. What did I say? Emily hurried around the kitchen island as fast as her baby belly would allow and scooped Becca up in a hug. Between them, a sharp kick alerted both women to the presence of the new little Callahan, and Becca gulped back a full-on sob. I'm never going to have a baby. She pulled away from Emily and grabbed a paper towel to blot at her eyes. I'm an old maid. What do you mean an old maid? You're only 29. Who told you that? Emily demanded, planting her fists on her curvy hips, green eyes flashing. Becca blew her nose. My cousin Evie. Who does this Evie think she is? Do I have to beat her up? Becca gave her a half-smile. No. Evie can't help it. She's always been outspoken. She's right, though. Ever since she said that, jokingly, at my parents' New Year's party, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. How am I supposed to meet a man if I can't even look a stranger in the face? Emily herded Becca into one of the chairs at her little pink and green enameled dinette table. She poured Becca a mug of coffee and added cream and sugar, just the way Becca liked it. I've been thinking for a while, too, Emily admitted, sitting down across from her. I think you should call Dr. Lachele. Becca had heard of Lachele. She owned Matchrimony and had been responsible for introducing Emily and the love of her life, Brody, a sweet, handsome cowboy from South Dakota. At the altar. It wasn't a conventional way to go about getting married, but Emily now had a beautiful little family, which included the grandfatherly William, Emily's former doorman from New York who lived in an apartment over the garage, her nephew and soon-to-be adopted son, Alec, and a new baby on the way, and Emily was creating a happily ever after life with all of them in a sprawling old Tennessee farmhouse. Becca couldn't pretend that she hadn't thought of the matchmaker as a solution to her problems. She was cursed with a crippling shyness that made it difficult to speak to anyone, much less a man, and the idea of not having to meet her future husband until she said her vows was appealing. She sighed but finally nodded in acceptance. You're right. It's not the way I'd always dreamed it would happen, but unless I really do want to become an old maid, I think matrimony might be my only hope. Emily smiled delightedly and clapped her hands together. Don't you worry about a thing. Dr. Lachele has a perfect track record. I'll go find her card, and I just know she'll find you exactly the man you need. Archer Hayes was looking for the nearest exit. He hadn't really wanted to come to the charity gala to begin with, but since he had a younger sister who had died from the disease at only 6 years old, he believed in the Children's Leukemia Foundation's mission and always did all he could to support their cause. The glittering event was held annually in Asheville, North Carolina, and drew big, wealthy crowds, so theoretically, it was a good time to network for potential clients for his family's investment firm. At least that was his mother's opinion. To Archer, the idea was distasteful. And right now, his mother was heading purposefully in his direction like a ship in full sail, with a lovely blonde hooked on one arm. He was trapped between a potted palm and an elderly couple when his mother, Lavinia Elaine Sutton Hayes, cornered him. Surrounded in a cloud of Chanel No. 5, she wore a gleaming smile that shone like the gold beating in her formal length dress and the determination in her pale blue eyes. Sweetheart, she cooed, leaning forward to kiss him on one cheek and brush a little non-existent lint off the lapel of his tux. I've been looking everywhere for you. She turned to the petite blonde next to her. I wanted to introduce you to the daughter of a dear friend of mine. This is Harper Woodham. Her daddy is Wade Woodham. You remember. He owns that chain of restaurants in Raleigh. Her mama and I play racquetball at the Biltmore on Tuesdays. Archer squashed down his annoyance and smiled politely at Harper. It wasn't her fault that his mother drove him crazy every time she tried to set him up with another young society girl. He held out his hand and took her delicate, demurely manicured one, bowing his head slightly. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Woodham. Harper stared back up at him, her brown eyes wide, lips parted, not saying a word. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and he almost winced at how young she looked, speechless in her pretty white dress. Archer would be 36 on his next birthday and was far too jaded for a naive little girl like Harper. My apologies, he said smoothly into the awkward silence, but if you'll both excuse me, I see someone across the room I need to speak with. Lavinia grabbed his sleeve with a deceptively tight grip. Archer, don't rush off, she ordered. You look so handsome in your formal wear. Doesn't the black and white just suit him right down to the ground with that dark hair of his, Harper? Archer felt himself flush a little, but Harper just stared at him, her mouth still open a little, and gave a faint nod. Mama, he said firmly. I've got to talk to Devon Halloway. You know, the Devon Halloway that owns the Mercedes dealership in Hendersonville? If there was one thing that could trump his mother's matchmaking efforts, it was business. Oh, she fluttered, releasing him. Well, if that's the case, off with you. As he gave Harper an apologetic smile, he quickly moved away, hearing his mother's voice trailing after him. Such a devoted son, she was saying. He took over Hayes Investments after his father passed, the dear man. He works too hard. He needs a wife to look after him. A wife, Archer thought with a wry twist to his lips, ducking out of the ballroom through a side entrance. If he had a wife, he wouldn't have to deal with Lavinia's attempts to set him up. Unfortunately, he was too busy running the Hayes empire to find a wife, so the only way he was going to get one was to let his mother play matchmaker. He tipped the coat-room attendant and headed out into the chilly February night to wait for the valet to bring his car. The cold air felt good after the heated crush of the gala. He slid into his sleek black Jaguar, still brooding over the embarrassment of having Lavinia throw women at him. He was doomed to marry one of the colorless girls she was always parading in front of him. Unless he found another matchmaker instead. Stop pacing, Rebecca, Granny Jones boomed out from her easy chair in the corner of the living room. You're going to wear a rut in your mama's floor. I can't help it. I've changed my mind, Becca said, a panicky feeling crawling in her stomach as she pulled back the flowered curtain to look down the street again. It was still empty of cars. You can't change your mind now. That doctor is on her way here, and she's flown all the way from New York. I know your daddy's not convinced, but if you ask me, Granny thumped her cane on the floor for emphasis. I think an arranged marriage is a fine idea. Becca peeked out the window again. She felt herself start to hyperventilate. A little white sedan was pulling into the driveway. Answer the door, she begged her grandma. Tell her I'm not here. Good Lord, child, Granny Jones said, scandalized. I'm not going to lie to the poor woman. The doorbell rang, and feeling lightheaded, Becca went to open it. A petite woman stood on the steps with a briefcase, bright smile, and hair the color of the Concord grape juice Becca's mom canned every fall. You must be Becca, she said cheerfully. Your voice sounded so soft and pretty over the phone, but you're a stunner in person, aren't you? She stepped in without waiting to be asked, or answered, and pulled Becca into such a warm hug that she was reminded of Emily. Ask the woman in, silly, her grandma hollered from the living room. I'm sorry, Becca stammered. Please. Welcome. Don't you be nervous, girlfriend, Dr. Lachele said, giving her a sweet smile. You'd be surprised at how many of my future brides are scared to death of their interviews. Suck it up, Becca, she told herself fiercely as she took Lachele's coat. Welcome to my home, Becca tried again, pleased when her voice didn't shake. If you want to come on into the living room, I can get you something hot to drink. Dr. Lachele chuckled. You mean you think it's cold out there? Back in Manhattan, I just missed a raging blizzard that would have cancelled my flight, and the wind chill is almost 5 below zero. 30 degrees in Tennessee feels like a heat wave. She accepted the offer of hot chocolate, though, and introduced herself to Granny Jones, who eyed her purple hair speculatively. Lachele kept up a light chatter as she settled in on the worn sofa with an ease that Becca envied. What would it be like to be that confident? But Dr. Lachele was such an easy person to be around that before Becca knew it, she was conversing with no trouble at all. Lachele asked about Emily and the baby, the newest matrimony munchkin, she said. She wanted to know all about Becca's family, her parents and brothers, and what life was like in the rural mountains of Tennessee. So casually that Becca hardly noticed, Dr. Lachele finally worked her way around to the true reason for her visit. She needs a man, Granny Jones said bluntly. Our Becca's a good girl, but she gets tongue-tied when she tries to talk to people. Granny. It's true, and you know it, Granny Jones shot back, the wrinkles in her face deepening in a frown. Becca adored her grandmother, but her outspokenness was so embarrassing sometimes. She looked at Lachele miserably. It's true. You're probably my only chance at marriage, Dr. Lachele. Lachele smiled back kindly. Don't you worry about another thing, from what I've seen, any man would be lucky to get a woman like you. I'm just surprised they haven't been beating your door down before now. Maybe they're intimidated by that grandmother of yours, she teased, winking at Granny Jones, who cackled appreciatively. What kind of man are you looking for, Becca? Tall, dark, and handsome, she blurted without thinking and blushed hotly. Ah, an old cliché for a reason. Lachele flipped a notebook open and chuckled as she started making notes. What about personality? Likes? Dislikes? Really, I don't mind. I can get along with all sorts of people. Granny Jones snorted. You let me handle this part, Rebecca. You're too sweet for your own good. Becca tried to protest, but Granny Jones levered herself creakily out of her chair, standing as tall as an 89-year-old 4 feet 11 inches woman could make herself, and thumped her cane on the floor again. She needs someone to take care of her. Our Becca bends over backward for everyone else. She cleans 9 houses a week, working those pretty hands until they're calloused and worn, and if she keeps it up, she'll be old before her time. Gives all her money away, too, to the church and charity and family and what have you. Find her a rich, handsome man, Dr. Lachele. She deserves it. Really, Granny? No, Becca insisted. I don't care if he lives in a shack, and I was kidding about the dark and handsome thing. I'd be happy with a widower with children to take care of. I honestly like to work. It makes me feel useful. Dr. Lachele just watched the two of them with interest, a broad smile on her face, and went back to jotting notes in her book. In the 3 weeks since the charity fundraiser, Lavinia had been showing up wherever Archer happened to be, at least once a day, dragging poor Harper along with her. Enough was enough. He had an appointment in just a few minutes that would stop her matchmaking efforts in the most permanent way possible. When his personal assistant rang through to tell him that his 1 o'clock had arrived, Archer pushed his chair back from his heavy cherrywood desk and headed for the hallway. His assistant, Donna, was just rounding the corner with a woman who looked like a short, plump, purple-haired elf. Hiding his surprise at Dr. Lachele's appearance, he shook her hand. Well, aren't you just the epitome of tall, dark, and handsome? She grinned, returning his handshake briskly. Donna looked between the two of them, her eyes wide. Archer's lips quirked reluctantly in a grin. It's nice to meet you, Dr. Simpson. Why don't we step into my office? Donna, could you bring us a couple of bottles of water, please? Donna dragged her curious gaze away and trotted down the hall. Call me Lachele. Well, Mr. Hayes, you have quite an office here. She ran an appreciative gaze over the floor-to-ceiling windows, the antique, masculine furniture, and the heavy Turkish rugs on the floor. Thank you, he replied wryly, sitting down at his desk and motioning Dr. Lachele to a chair. I can't take credit, though. It was my father's. I'm sorry, Lachele said, her eyes glimmering sympathetically. You said that in past tense. Has he passed away? Yes. About 12 years ago. I was 24 when I took over the firm. Young for that kind of responsibility. Archer laughed humorlessly. I'd been groomed for it. Donna tapped tentatively at the door and brought in their bottles of water. Mr. Hayes, she whispered. Your mother is here to see you. She's brought Miss Harper. Archer let out a sigh and only just managed to not roll his eyes. Tell my mother I'm in an important meeting and I'll call her later, please. Mother troubles? Dr. Lachele asked kindly when Donna had left again. You have no idea. She's trying to set me up, again, with a girl of her choosing. That's why I called you. If I'm being pestered into marriage anyway, I'm going to need someone who doesn't care about money and who is strong enough to stand up to a meddling mother-in-law. Mr. Hayes. Lachele's voice was firm, and she sat forward to pin him with her gaze. I match people who I believe will make a good life together, people who will care for and support each other, fall in love, share in trials and troubles, and provide me with munchkins to spoil. I don't deal in marriages of convenience. You need to be prepared to treat your match with as much consideration as you would if you had known and loved the woman for years. Unless you can convince me that you are interested in a real marriage, and not just a convenient arrangement to stop your mama's meddling, we have no further business to discuss. Archer leaned back, somewhat surprised but impressed by Dr. Lachele's obvious dedication to her craft. He let himself actually think about it. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, not under threat of torture, but he was tired. Tired of his mother's scheming, of course. Tired of being solely responsible for the Hayes' millions. And most of all, tired of coming home to a big, empty house, where he rattled around like a pebble in a tin can, all by himself. He wanted someone to like him for himself, and darn it, he was lonely. Yes, he finally replied. I'm willing to give marriage my full dedication. I would like a wife to share my life with. In that case, Dr. Lachele responded, her expression softening into a smile as she took out a purple notebook and a sparkly pen. Tell me all about yourself, Archer. Chapter 2. I'm going to hyperventilate. Breathe, she told herself. You can do this. But Becca couldn't help it. She was coming close to panic territory. She looked around the pretty retiring room of the church with frantic eyes, wondering if there was a drainpipe outside the window she could slide down and escape. Not that she could get far in what she was wearing. Her entire family had chipped in to buy her a wedding gown, even her cousin Evie, and it was beautiful. Virginal white, with smooth satin and lace so delicate it looked like it was woven from cobwebs. She was afraid to move, much less run. Calm down, Emily said soothingly, patting her hand. Thankfully, it was just the two of them. Trust me. Dr. Lachele knows what she's doing. Plus, you'll only be a couple hours away, so I can come straight to you anytime you need me. Becca studied her face in the mirror. She looked pale, her blue eyes standing out darkly against her white skin. I can't do this, she said to her best friend, feeling dizzy with nervousness. I just know I'm going to go out there and puke on the minister or something. I have literally never been this scared in my entire life. I've got this. Dr. Lachele's determined, cheerful voice startled Becca, and she jumped. Emily, hon, give us a minute, will you? I'll be right out there in the front row if you need me, Becca, even if I have to kick somebody out of the pew to do it, Emily assured her and gave her another quick hug. Trust me. This will all work out beautifully. All right, now, Becca. It's almost go time, Lachele said. You look gorgeous, and you're going to knock the socks off your groom. I have to tell you a secret before you go out there, though. I picked this man for you because he needs a strong woman, a strong partner. And I know you're going to be that for him. You just have to believe that you can be, too. Becca stared at Lachele. You think I'm strong? She let out a burst of slightly hysterical laughter. As if the pressure of becoming a stranger's wife wasn't enough, now she had to be strong, too? Yes, Lachele replied firmly. Shy, yes. But shy and strong are two completely different things. You've got a backbone of steel in there, girlfriend, and you're going to have to figure out how to use it. Now come on. Give me a booby bump, and let's get this dog and pony show on the road. Becca laughed helplessly, feeling strangely better as she followed Dr. Lachele out the door. The woman was a little crazy, but she sure had confidence to spare. It wouldn't hurt her to borrow some. Her father was waiting for her outside the door to the sanctuary. Ready to go, baby girl? He asked gruffly. He was big and broad, his blonde hair just starting to fade to gray, and his smile was bright and wide, but his eyes were sad. Becca noticed his suit was outdated and just a bit tight around his waist, but he was still the most handsome man in the world to her. I love you, Daddy. Love you, too, honey. This man of yours better be a good one, or he'll answer to me. He took her arm and led her through the heavily carved double doors, the intimidating sound of the wedding march booming right up to the vaulted ceiling. Instantly Becca wanted to retreat, but she forced herself to take the measured steps forward that would carry her to the front of the room. Who are all of these people? She whispered to her father a little frantically. Beats me. Maybe the groom has a big family, he whispered back. She looked out over the sea of unfamiliar faces. There must have been 100 well-dressed strangers filling the pews, all watching her with curiosity. Her racing heart calmed a little, though, when she saw her Granny Jones waving one gnarled hand enthusiastically from the front pew, Becca's mom beside her, trying to pull her arm down. Emily and Brody Callahan sat beside them, with William and Alec. The Callahan son crossed his eyes and stuck his tongue out at her, and Becca smiled back reflexively. He was such a little rascal. Then, she gathered her courage and looked toward the altar. Becca's heart stuttered in her chest. The man of her dreams stood there. Tall, dark, and handsome didn't do him justice. In crisp, black and white formal wear, her groom stood about 6 feet tall, trim and well-built. His face was unsmiling, but his deep blue eyes were watching her with a curious, cautious intensity that made her feel warm inside. His dark brown, almost black hair looked expensively cut, and she wondered if it would feel as soft under her fingertips as it looked. Shyness forgotten, she nearly floated to the altar on the power of his sharp blue gaze alone. She couldn't wait to meet this man. Archer felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The ethereal-looking beauty coming down the aisle had her gaze fixed on him like he was the most important man in the world. She wore a long, lacy white dress and seemed to glide, willowy and graceful. Her hair was long and pale blonde, twisted back at the sides to leave her face uncovered, and what a face it was. Her skin was porcelain fine, flushed delicately pink at her cheekbones, and her cobalt eyes looked as serene as a deep, calm lake. The big, shabbily dressed man who escorted her down the aisle took the woman's hand and placed it in Archer's, and he barely noticed the man's scowl. The woman's hand wasn't smooth or delicate. Her calluses told of a life of hard work, and he was struck by curiosity. Hello, he offered quietly, barely mindful of their large audience. Hello, she whispered back, giving him a tentative smile, her pink lips parting to reveal even white teeth and an enchanting smile. In the audience, a loud, dramatic sob broke the stillness, and Archer winced. It was his mother. Startled, Becca turned around. An older woman, dressed in an extravagantly beaded black dress more appropriate for a funeral, stood up and let out another wail. Don't do this, Archer. I want you married but not to her. Becca's jaw dropped at the woman's utter rudeness. Archer squeezed her hand reassuringly, but before he could respond, Granny Jones pushed to her feet and hollered, Pipe down, lady, and act your age instead of your Goldengage shoe size. Can't you see we're trying to have a wedding here? She waved her cane at the woman threateningly, almost whacking the person behind her. The man ducked, wide-eyed. The rude woman dropped down in her seat, abruptly lapsing into astonished silence. Becca let out a low groan, her face pinkening in mortification, but Archer just chuckled and squeezed her hand again, his palm broad, warm, and comforting. Sorry, sweetheart, but I think I'm going to have to marry her instead. No one stood up to my mother like that in years. Oh, goodness, Becca thought. She's going to be my new mother-in-law? But the way Archer's eyes gleamed at her settled her fears a bit even as her heart started fluttering double time. She had a feeling that this man might just be worth the torture. The elderly minister cleared his throat, his watery brown eyes wide. We ready to begin now? Or should I ask the guests if anyone else has objections first? Becca and Archer spoke at the same time, no. To Becca, it seemed like only moments later they were being declared Mr. and Mrs. Archer Hayes. The kiss Archer gave her was restrained, almost polite, but it buckled Becca's knees. She'd never felt a man's mouth on her own, and even though it was brief, the feel of his firm lips on hers, his breath scented with peppermint, made her lightheaded. Her new husband's guests applauded politely as they walked down the aisle together, Becca's wobbly legs hurrying to keep up with Archer's stride. Meanwhile, Becca's family cheered and whistled rowdily and Archer's mother sobbed dramatically. When they exited the church, the crowd of guests surging behind them like a wave, Dr. Lachele was there to motion them over to a long black limousine, Becca's wrap in one hand to protect her from the chill in the air. "Hop in," she said cheerfully, snugging the imitation white fur around Becca's shoulders. "Get to know each other before you get to the reception. I'll see you both there." Lachele bussed them both on the cheek, reaching up on her tiptoes to get to Archer's, and she ushered them into the limo, closing the door behind them. Then, Becca was alone with her groom. In the dimness of the interior, he grinned at her and stuck out his hand. "Archer Hayes. Nice to meet you." Becca laughed shyly and stuck out her own hand. "Rebecca Hayes. But, since you're my husband, I guess you can call me Becca." His hand lingered on hers for a moment, his eyes intent on hers. "Becca, that's a pretty name. It sounds sweet and innocent. May I kiss you, Becca?" "I'd like to try again, without an audience this time." Archer leaned forward when she nodded hesitantly, putting a hand to her face. Unlike her rough hands, the skin of her cheek felt satiny smooth and cool, like porcelain, beneath his touch. He lowered his mouth to hers as her eyes went round and surprised before drifting closed, her pale lashes fanning against her cheeks. Innocent, he thought before his mind went blank. Her small hands went to his shoulders, as if to anchor herself, and his hand slid over the furry wrap covering her back to pull her closer. She kissed him back, eager, if inexperienced, and her enthusiasm ignited him. Pulling away after a moment, he looked at his beautiful blonde bride. Her cheeks were crimson now, much warmer than they had been, and her blue eyes sparkled with wonder. He'd never had anyone look at him like this. Like they saw him for who he really was, and not for what they could get out of him. This was why he'd wanted a matchmaker. Becca had no idea that he was ridiculously wealthy, and by the look on her face, she wouldn't have cared if he lived in a cardboard box. Archer felt something unfurl in his chest that felt suspiciously like hope. Becca's mind felt fuzzy. She wasn't sure if it was because she hadn't been able to eat breakfast that morning, or if it was the after-effects of Archer's kiss. She almost forgot to be shy, she was too overwhelmed with everything that had happened. She was about to ask Archer about himself, since she couldn't wait to find out more about this dazzling man who seemed to be just as attracted to her as she was to him, but the limo was pulling to a smooth stop. "We're here already," she breathed in disappointment. He tucked a finger under her chin and tilted her face up. "Don't worry," his voice rumbled. "A couple of hours and we can be on our way to our home." He kissed her again, gently, and opened the door, getting out first so he could help her. Becca's eyes widened. In front of them was a sprawling red brick building with huge, arched windows, surrounded by sprawling hills. "What is this place?" "Rolling Brook Country Club," Archer said casually. "I let my mom book the event, since she insisted on being involved, and she wasn't able to get our regular club with such short notice." Prepare to hear her complain. Archer took her arm and led her up to the wide front porch bracketed with tall white columns. A country club. Becca had been in one before, but only as a temporary waitress for a catering gig. It mostly hadn't been bad, since she hadn't been noticed by the patrons any more than the potted plants were, but her cheeks heated as she remembered one man had pinched her bottom and called her sugar. She could only hope that Archer's friends weren't like that. With his casual attitude about the whole thing, fancy country clubs were nothing new to him. A skinny young man in a thin coat stood shivering in the breeze by the front door, waiting with a camera. Without asking, he snapped several photos of the two of them. Dropping his camera to hang around his neck from the strap, he pulled a small notebook out of his pocket and a stub of a pencil. "Mrs. Hayes," he asked in a reedy voice, "who designed your dress?" "Anna Cara? Vera Wong?" I'm not sure," Becca answered. "It came from Wedding Warehouse?" The man snorted out a laugh. "Your new wife's funny, Hayes." "What about the wrap? Arctic Fox?" "No, it's fake," she answered apologetically. "Vegan, must be," he nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "Excuse us," Archer smiled remotely. "I'd like to get my bride in out of the cold." "Who was that man?" Becca asked as Archer led her through the door, feeling as if she'd done something wrong. "He writes for the society page in the Raleigh Caller." Becca gulped and looked around her. They were in a wide foyer, with gleaming parquet floors and high, arched ceilings. A man in uniform deferentially took their coats and gestured them into the ballroom, quietly offering his congratulations on their marriage, which Archer accepted with an absent nod. Becca smiled gratefully at the man and thanked him, and his eyes widened in surprise before he gave her a friendly grin. The ballroom was massive, decorated with enough flowers and greenery to fill an entire greenhouse, and enough swaths of white satin and bows to outfit an entire battalion of brides. "Your mother did a lovely job," she offered. Archer grinned down at her wickedly, raising his voice a little bit over the string quartet tuning up their instruments nearby. "Letting her do the reception was the least I could do after I opted not to pick a bride of her choosing." Becca immediately felt a pang of worry. "I don't want to drive a wedge between you and your mother." "You won't," he assured her. "Would you introduce me to your family?" Becca heard a familiar squeal and turned to see Emily waddling to her as fast as her baby belly would allow. Hot on her trail was Granny Jones. She'd tied lace bows to her cane at some point for the occasion and wore a moth-eaten velveteen hat that looked as if it had fallen out of 1955. Behind them, the rest of Becca's family was clustered into a knot, gaping at the beautifully decorated space. Streaming around both sides of them were Archer's guests, already chattering and helping themselves to the champagne waiters were bringing around on trays. Becca's heart squeezed with love. To others, they might be an odd-looking group, but they were all hers. She took Archer's hand and led him to meet Emily halfway. Archer didn't seem snobbish at all. He was smooth and polite, charming even, with Becca's mom and grandma. Her dad, she noticed, wasn't quite convinced, but he mumbled to Becca that Archer had a good handshake, which was one of his marks of approval. Becca's dad couldn't stand a limp handshake, so Archer had passed the test there, anyway. He seemed to hit it off with Emily's husband, Brody, right away, and the two started talking about horses. Becca felt the nervous tension in her chest start to ease a little as it became obvious that Archer wasn't going to snub any of her friends and family. Until she saw his mother bearing down on them. Despite her crying at the wedding, crocodile tears, Becca was sure, her makeup was as pristine as a TV newscaster's. She gave Becca a cool look before latching her hand on to Archer's arm possessively. "Archer," she said in a wheedling tone, "don't you think you should mingle with your other guests? I've invited some very important people. The lieutenant governor is here, and I promised you'll come say hello." Becca's husband gave an almost unnoticeable sigh. "Mother, I'd like to introduce you to my wife." He reached for Becca's hand, dislodging his mother's in the process. She gave him a fulminating glare, but he pretended not to notice. "Becca, my mother. Lavinia Sutton Hayes. Pleased to meet you." Becca held out a hand, but Lavinia ignored it, and Becca let her hand fall back to her side awkwardly. "Charmed, I'm sure," Lavinia drawled, "but Archer, dear, Gary Parker is here, too. Now's the perfect time to talk to him about." He cut her off again smoothly. "No work on my wedding day. Tomorrow soon enough." He went on to introduce Lavinia to the rest of Becca's family, remembering everyone's names, she noticed. "But tomorrow?" Becca looked at him from under her lashes. He couldn't be serious. He was planning to go back to work tomorrow? She'd been hoping for a little longer than an afternoon to get to know her new husband. More than an afternoon to get used to the idea that she was now married. Lavinia suffered through the introductions, her eyes narrowing into a glare on Granny Jones, who snorted wetly before shaking Lavinia's manicured hand as vigorously as she would an old dust rag. But as soon as she'd acknowledged everyone, Lavinia turned on her heel abruptly. "As soon as you're ready to greet them, Archer, your people are waiting to congratulate you." As she sailed away, Granny Jones, loudly enough to carry across the room, said, "Land sakes. I've seen better manners on a pig, bless her heart." Lavinia's back went stiff, but she didn't acknowledge the insult. "Well, that went as well as could be expected," Archer said dryly. "May I have this dance, wife?" He nodded to her family as he pulled her away to the dance floor. "I'm sorry about that," he murmured to Becca as he drew her close. "You'll get used to her. I promise." But Lavinia was forgotten as the two of them began to move. Becca reveled in Archer's strong embrace. He smelled of aftershave and peppermint, and he moved as if he'd been born to dance. She caught her breath as he twirled her, and she felt like a princess for a moment, her dress swirling around her legs. There was scattered applause around them as she laughed, and he dipped her deeply. The dance seemed to go on forever, and she was dizzy with happiness when they finally stopped, and Archer flagged down a waiter. "Champagne?" Becca sipped, the bubbles tickling her nose. Archer leaned down and kissed her again. I do love the taste of champagne," he murmured, and she blushed hotly, aware they were being watched by dozens of pairs of eyes. Everything went wonderfully after that, even though Lavinia sat at her left when they were seated for an amazing luncheon, served up in 6 courses. The woman ignored her, and Becca was able to ignore her as well until the woman abruptly stood up and tapped on her wine glass with a knife, drawing everyone's attention. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced. "To my beloved son and his lovely bride." Lavinia gestured to Becca a little wildly, a glint in her eye. Becca watched in almost slow motion as the ruby-colored liquid sloshed around in the full glass, before Lavinia's wrist seemed to twist, and the cup tipped. Becca stared in horror as the wine poured over her in a thick stream, drenching her hair, running down her nose, soaking into the delicate lace and silky fabric of the gown that she'd been so proud of. The wedding dress she hoped to pass on to a daughter someday. Chapter 3. Becca gasped, unable to do anything for a moment but gape at her now ruined wedding finery. She looked up at Lavinia, who seemed almost shocked, too, for a moment before she chuckled uneasily. "My, how could I have been so clumsy?" Becca glanced at Archer to see his reaction, but he was watching her almost interestedly, as if waiting for her reaction. A sudden surge of anger caught her by surprise in its intensity, and she opened her mouth to insist that he do something about his mother. But before she could, there was a splashing and sputtering sound next to her. Granny Jones stood there defiantly, holding an empty water glass. Lavinia's bouffant hairdo was plastered to her head unevenly, and her mouth was wide open. She looked like a beached trout, gasping for air. "Oh, Granny. The old bat did it on purpose. We all saw it." Granny looked around for confirmation, but when she was faced with an array of shocked faces, she grinned self-consciously and sat back down. Of all the, Lavinia couldn't come up with any words, and her mouth worked for a moment. Becca sighed. It looked like it was going to be up to her to apologize. Granny certainly wouldn't, and Archer didn't look like he was going to intervene. "Lavinia," she began, but the woman whirled on her sharply. You bunch of hillbillies," she shrieked. "I don't even know where you people come from." "Tennessee," Brody put in helpfully, his eyes twinkling with suppressed humor. Emily nudged him sharply in the ribs, and he grunted. "Of course," Lavinia said, throwing up her hands, a few more drops of wine spraying everyone within range. "And now, this grasping, greedy little backwoods redneck has sunk her claws into my precious baby, probably just for his millions. None of this would have happened if you'd just married Harper Woodham." Becca stood up slowly. It was all too much. The stress, the fear, the joy she'd experienced today, and now this. Her lovely dress destroyed, and this woman had the nerve to insult her family. She looked down at Archer, giving him one last chance to redeem himself. To stand up for her. But he just watched her steadily, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed as if he was watching a particularly unexciting sport on TV. Was he wishing he'd married Harper Woodham, whoever she was? It was just too much. Becca looked down again at the dark stains on her dress, gathered her long skirts in her shaking hands, and ran from the ballroom with tears blurring her eyes. Archer sighed in disappointment. So much for his brave new wife. He was so hoping that Dr. Lachele had found him a strong woman who would be able to stand up to his mother. It was all he'd asked. He looked around and realized that everyone was staring at him with accusing looks and flushed. He supposed he should have stepped in and interfered, but he had been eager to see how Becca handled things. Wordlessly, the women stood up and hurried in the direction Becca had gone. At least Becca's mother and friends did. Becca's dad was glaring at him in a way that made him a little nervous. Lavinia whined because he wasn't paying attention to her, but it was Dr. Lachele that caught his attention. "Can I speak with you for a moment, Mr. Hayes?" she asked. Her tone was frighteningly like that of his 8th-grade English teacher, Mrs. Eldridge, when she was about to light into him for flunking his research paper on koalas. He followed the sweet lady, her purple heels tapping sharply on the floor. When they reached the foyer, she spun around, her eyes flashing. "Okay," he said, lifting his hands in surrender. "I should have said something. But you were supposed to be pairing me up with a strong woman." "Sure was," Lachele huffed, "and that's exactly what I did. But nothing in my interview with you made me imagine that you'd leave your wife to face that harpy alone." Archer snorted a surprised laugh. "Did you just call my mother a harpy?" Lachele had the grace to blush. "I'm a psychologist. I call them like I see them, and I certainly don't hear you arguing with my assessment. Now how fair do you think it is to not back up poor Becca when she's faced with a situation like she just went through? You didn't make the best first impression, my boy, that I can tell you, and you owe her an apology. A huge apology. Becca is an absolute joy, and you're lucky to have her. You get to know her, and you'll see her strengths soon enough." Dr. Lachele nodded her head significantly, and he turned around. Becca, pale but composed, was approaching him from across the foyer. Her dress was damp in patches, the red wine stains now a paler pink. Her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment, and his breath caught at how pretty she was, even disheveled. "Would you like to go home?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes bright for a moment at the word home. They dimmed a little when she realized he meant their home, but she nodded gamely. "What about your guests, though?" "Our guests will understand. At least I hope yours will. I don't know half of mine, anyway." It took a little bit of time, since Becca's goodbyes with her family took much longer than his, but Archer held on to his patience. She was obviously very close to them, he noticed, as he watched her hug her mother and then her grandma tightly, tears in her eyes. Even her dad was wiping his eyes discreetly. He couldn't imagine anyone in his family showing that kind of open affection, and frankly, he was a little bit jealous. Finally, she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, nodding to him. He held out an arm, ignored his mother's wailing, and led Becca out into the brisk, sunny February afternoon, where a valet had parked his car. "I hope you don't mind," Archer said, "but I had someone load your things in the trunk." He held the passenger side door of the low-slung black Mercedes open for her, and she slid in gracefully. "You didn't have much. Will you be shipping the rest?" "No," she said softly. "I didn't have much to bring." He decided then that would change, and soon. His unspoiled bride might be timid, but she certainly hadn't come from money, his other request for Dr. Lachele, and Archer planned on enjoying spoiling her. His wife wouldn't want for anything. Becca waited nervously for Archer to round the car. How long would the car ride be? Where did he even live? How was she going to ever make conversation? Why did he have to look so darned handsome in that tux of his? He was her storybook hero come to life. At least he would have been if he'd tackled that dragon mother of his, but she reminded herself that no one was perfect and she was in no position to cast stones. He settled into the driver's seat, and she sneaked a glance at him. He was watching her with those sharp blue eyes, thoughtfully. "I'm sorry about what happened in there," While his mom had been creating such a scene, for a brief, crazy moment, Becca had wanted to scream at him, yell at him, grab him by his lapels, and shake some sense into his handsome head, but now, with him actually apologizing, she knew she never would have had the guts to do something like that anyway. Any anger she had left melted away, and she just nodded. Seemingly satisfied, he looked away and put the car into gear. The luxury car pulled away from the curb almost as quietly as if it weren't running at all. She stifled a giggle. The elderly Jeep Wrangler she'd borrowed from her cousin Jim to get to her house-cleaning jobs sounded like a jumbo jet in comparison. "So, your family is from Tennessee?" Archer asked. "What area?" Becca glanced at him to be sure he wasn't mocking her country upbringing, like his mother had been, but he seemed genuinely inquisitive. "Yes, we mostly live around Wolf Creek." "I've never heard of it." "How far away is Wolf Creek?" "From here, just about an hour and a half." "Same mountains," she said a little wistfully, looking out the window. "Just on the other side of them. We'll go car shopping for you tomorrow," Archer promised. "That's not far away, and you can visit any time you want." "Actually, we won't go car shopping tomorrow. I have a board meeting that I can't miss. But if you know what you want, I can just have my dealership deliver it." I don't need a car. I'll be fine without one." Archer gave her a grin. "You're getting a car. Pick a make, model, and color, or I'll do it for you." "I can afford it." Becca caught the wicked twinkle in his eye, but she still couldn't believe that he'd just snap his fingers and make a car magically appear for her. "Fine," she teased tentatively. "I'd like a 1992 Ford Taurus station wagon, as rusted out as possible, please, but with a solid motor." His grin fell away, and his voice was serious when he answered. "You have to have the best. You're a Hayes now, and people will talk otherwise." Immediately, Becca felt guilty. She now had a standard to live up to? What if his mother was right? What if hillbilly was practically tattooed on her forehead? Would she shame Archer and make him regret ever marrying her? The silence in the car grew heavy, but thankfully, Archer turned down a drive paved with stone. Charming, age-softened, mossy stone walls lined it on either side, and thick old trees, bare of leaves now, speared up on both sides. They rounded a bend, and Becca gasped. Archer chuckled. "I get that a lot, the first time people see this place." He pulled the car up under a wide portico that stuck off of the back of the house, huge and square with two wings, built of stone and full of large white-paned windows. "This has been in our family for over 100 years. A European count built this house in 1840 for his countess." "Wait until you see the inside." "This might be a dumb question," Becca practically whispered, "but does anyone else live here?" Asher shook his head. "I have a housekeeper that comes every day and cooks all of the meals, but she lives in the old converted carriage house on a different part of the property. I also have a regular maid service that comes in daily to clean. Otherwise, it'll be just you and me." The way he said the last words made her immediately go red. He just shot her another impish smile and got out of the car. "A mansion. A housekeeper. A maid service." Becca felt frozen to her seat. He must be a millionaire. No wonder his mother was furious. Her son had married the help. Becca's head was spinning. Archer had shown her to a powder room where she could change out of her wedding dress, and she was surrounded by fabulous French-looking antiques, fixtures that looked like real gold, and even a mural of water nymphs painted behind a giant sunken bathtub. Checking her reflection in a large, gilt-painted mirror, she studied the skinny woman that stared back, dressed in thick wool socks. Her feet were always cold, jeans with a hole in the knee, and a hand-me-down high school sweatshirt from her oldest brother, who'd worn it when he played football. A whole decade ago. Becca wasn't vain, by any means, but as she pulled her long hair into a simple ponytail, she did wish she had something nicer to wear. But she'd never been anything other than practical. If clothes had wear left in them, why buy new ones? She felt a little bit better when she went out into the hallway and found Archer waiting for her. He was dressed in jeans, too, and a charcoal-colored sweater that looked so soft, her fingers itched to touch it. He smiled at her and gave a little tug on her ponytail. You could easily pass for about 16 in that outfit of yours. He took her hand, and she shivered. The warmth of his touch felt nice on her chilled fingers. Archer showed her around the house, but Becca was so tired that she only managed to register bits and pieces of her surroundings. Thick Persian rugs under her feet, more beautiful murals. Dozens of high, arched windows that looked out over beautiful European-looking gardens that would probably be incredible when they came out of winter's dormancy. Beyond those, the sun setting over misty purple mountains. When they came to the dining room, Becca let out a surprised laugh. Here's a room I haven't gotten a chance to restore, Archer said wryly. The long table, seated with 8 chairs, boasted gold-painted busts of women for legs. The chairs were painted gold, too, and had leopard print cushions that stood out against the formal elegance of the rest of the room. Feel free to have a hand at it, he offered. You couldn't do worse than my mom. No way, Becca murmured. I'd be afraid I'd mess something up. He just shrugged and continued out of the room. I'd just hire someone to fix it. He took her upstairs, where her blush made a reappearance as she realized that, of course, that's where the bedrooms were at. Archer seemed to understand, though. This is my room, he said briefly, opening the door to what was obviously a masculine haven, full of oversized dark wood furniture and dun shades of in dark forest greens. She felt her hands begin to shake nervously at the sight of the big 4-poster bed, with its silky green covers, and hoped he didn't notice. And down the hall is the room I had picked out for you, Archer added. Becca just barely stopped herself from clapping in delight. There was another Persian rug, in bold reds that stood out brightly against the walnut floors, and the walls were a red and white trellis-patterned wallpaper. She half expected the furniture to start talking, like she'd stumbled into a Disney movie. A huge armoire took up one wall, and a curved dresser stood against another, with a candelabra perched on top and a small, ornate clock next to it. Whoever had designed the room definitely had a sense of humor. The bed was smaller than Archer's, with a curved, padded velvet and cherrywood antique headboard, and a plush-down comforter in white with a pattern of tiny red roses. A small chandelier hung from the high ceiling above the bed. There was even a little fireplace on one wall and an attached bathroom with a clawfoot tub. It's gorgeous, Becca admitted. Fit for a princess. Archer leaned forward and surprised her with a sweet, brief kiss on the lips. You'll fit right in, then. At least until we get to know each other better. My room has a fireplace, too, he added teasingly. Now, before I try to get to know you a whole lot better right this second. Are you hungry? For another kiss, maybe, she almost said but stopped herself just in time. I could eat, she admitted instead. Let's raid the kitchen, then, and see what Jacqueline left for us. They ate cross-legged on the floor like kids in one of the sitting rooms, which held a cleverly hidden flat-screen TV behind a lovely painted screen that slid to one side. It turned out that Becca and Archer both liked old movies, and Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall were on screen, though the volume was turned low. Becca was surprised at how comfortable she was with Archer already despite their near fight on their own wedding day, not an hour after they'd first laid eyes on each other. I never would have found the TV on my own, Becca said before taking another big bite of the most delicious roast beef sandwich she could ever remember eating. You'll really have to poke around tomorrow. There's all kinds of modern things built into this house, and some really cool old secrets, too. Keep track of how many you find while I'm at work, and I'll quiz you when I get home. I wish you didn't have to go to work, she blurted out. Weren't couples supposed to have honeymoons? Or, at least in their case, a chance to get to know each other? Becca blushed, thinking about how much she liked the room he'd given her. But how green was also her favorite color. A bitter look passed across Archer's face, but it disappeared so quickly, Becca wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. I work a lot, he said flatly. I hope that's not a problem. Since my dad passed, I've run the Hayes' investment firm. I put in 80-hour workweeks sometimes, to make sure everyone in my family can live on in the style they're accustomed to. That didn't seem fair, but Becca tried to give Archer's family the benefit of the doubt and realized that they had something in common. I'm no stranger to work either, Becca told him. And I put in my fair share of long work weeks. Most of my money has always gone to family, too, or my community and my church. Selfless of you, Archer said, a glint of admiration in his eyes. Becca shrugged self-consciously. You're one to talk. Instead of answering, he looked up at the TV and took another bite of his sandwich, obviously uncomfortable with her praise. She wondered, though, all these years he'd been taking care of his family, who had been taking care of him. Chapter 4. Whether it was because she'd had such an eventful day or whether it was because of the heavenly mattress in her little red and white bed, Becca overslept for the first time in years. She jumped out of bed when she realized the sun was up and beaming through her windows and grabbed her tattered, terry-cloth robe, running for the stairs. But the house was echoingly empty, and Archer's Mercedes wasn't underneath the portico, where he'd parked it the night before. Her heart sank in disappointment. She'd wanted to be up to make him a cup of coffee before he left for work, ask him what was on his agenda. Make him laugh. He'd smiled some the day before, but Archer was way too serious. And she'd wanted to know when he'd be back and what his favorite food was, so she could make him something special for dinner. Heck, she wanted to tell him she was half in love with him already. Becca laughed at herself on her way back up the curving staircase. If she'd done all that, he probably would have run screaming into the woods. Nothing screamed wifely like pestering your brand new husband about when he'd be home from work, and nothing said crazy better than a woman who barely knew you trying to convince you that she loved you after only knowing you a day. Becca felt uncomfortably decadent as she soaked in the clawfoot bathtub with lavender-scented bubble bath that she'd found in a cupboard. She didn't know what else to do, though. On a normal Monday morning, she'd have been working already. Typically, she could clean 3 houses in a day, and her days were booked solid. Running from Monday through Friday. When she wasn't working, she was volunteering with the church or making meals for an elderly neighbor or running errands for her granny, who didn't choose to go out much in the wintertime. She blamed her rheumatiz, as she called it. Even surrounded by luxury, Becca couldn't help but feel a pang of homesickness. And guilt. She didn't really believe that idle hands were always the devil's playground, but she did believe in living a life of service. But with employees to run his house, what kind of service could she do? She decided she'd talk to Archer about it when he got home. Whenever that might be, she thought as she toweled herself off with a bath towel softer than a kitten's fur. When she ventured downstairs, she heard noises in the kitchen. Becca forgot for a moment that Archer employed a housekeeper and hurried in that direction. Maybe he'd changed his mind and come home? She came to a quick stop, skidding on the smooth tile floor, almost knocking over an antique bust that sat near the doorway. "Land sakes," came a woman's booming voice. "You scared the daylights out of me, missy." The woman, clenching a sharp knife to her chest and standing over a cutting board of minced vegetables at the marble island in the middle of the kitchen, was tall, probably an inch or so over 6 feet, and broad-shouldered, despite being probably around 60. She had a homely face, but the laugh lines on it showed that she was probably a good-natured person. She also looked very familiar, and Becca racked her brain for a moment, trying to place her face. "You must be the new wife," said the housekeeper, setting down her knife and coming around the counter. "Archie asked me to the wedding, but I didn't think it'd be proper, me being just the housekeeper." She stuck out her hand, and Becca shook it. "I'm Becca," she said shyly. "You must be Jacqueline?" The woman let out a surprisingly young-sounding giggle. "Jackie. Archie insists on calling me that because he knows I don't like it. That's why I call him Archie. I figure if it was good enough when he was 5, it's good enough now." "It's very nice to meet you, Becca. Want a cup of coffee?" "I'd love one, thank you." "I can get it, though." Jackie looked at her sideways. "You're not like the Hayes family, are you?" She blushed miserably. "Is it that obvious?" "No, honey, no." Jackie gave her a sympathetic pat on the shoulder that almost knocked her down. "Here. I'll get it for you." She pulled out a stool from the kitchen island, and "Becca Saturday, all I meant was," Jackie said, bustling over to the cupboard that held mugs, "that you don't seem all high in the instep." "No, my insteps are flat as can be," Becca muttered. It was more and more obvious that she was the last person Archer should have married. And the name you were looking for is Julia, by the way. Jackie set down a steaming mug in front of Becca and slid her a small cream pitcher and a little sugar bowl. Julia Child. That's who I usually remind people of. She grinned. Obviously, the comparison to a famous chef didn't bother her at all. Julia cooked a little better. But I'm a little taller. Becca giggled. It's nice to meet you, Jackie. Can I help you with anything today? Oh, no, Jackie stopped talking as Becca's face fell. Well, there is one thing. I was going to make some homemade bread, since Archie loves it so much, but my hands. She cracked her knuckles. A little bit of arthritis. You don't happen know how to knead bread dough, do you? Yes. Thank you, Becca said gratefully, wanting to cry at the woman's obvious effort to make her feel at home. She rolled up her sleeves instead. Now, let's see your recipe. I want to see how similar it is to mine. She was happily up to her elbows in flour. Jackie settled comfortably at the table with a cup of coffee, when Lavinia sailed into the kitchen. Jackie stopped in the middle of the story she'd been telling about Archer when he was little and jumped to her feet, automatically straightening her apron. If you'll excuse me, miss, Jackie blurted out, her face reddening. I'll just get to the laundry. She almost ran from the kitchen. Lavinia wore a pale pink pantsuit, pearls, and high heels that clattered against the floor tiles like machine gun fire. She spared only a glance at Jackie and sniffed disapprovingly before advancing on Becca like a military general. I'm sure you're used to having to cook for farmhands or something every day, she trilled, waving one heavily ringed hand, but the Hayes family never sullies their hands with menial labor. I like menial labor, Becca said quietly, her own hands clenching in the dough. Baking bread soothes me. Well, you don't have time to play in the kitchen right now. Lavinia's blue eyes were frosty. As a Hayes, you have responsibilities. Becca wanted to laugh. Archer's mother didn't think she had responsibilities before she got married. Instead, she turned her back deliberately on Lavinia and washed the sticky bread dough from her fingers in the deep sink behind her. What kind of responsibilities? She asked as she scrubbed, her hands turning red from the angry friction. Lavinia snapped her fingers sharply, and Becca turned around quickly, nearly ready to go off on the woman, Archer's mother, or not, snapping at her like a naughty puppy. But Lavinia was gesturing a small blonde woman into the room. She was very pretty, in a doll-like way, and her eyes were big and deep brown. She reminded Becca of a doe. This is Harper. Lavinia sounded almost gleeful when she made the introduction. Becca recognized a kindred soul when she saw one. Harper was shy. She was also terrified of Archer's mother. Becca dried her hands on a dish towel and stepped forward. It's very nice to meet you, Harper, she said to the younger girl with an encouraging smile and held out a hand. Harper shook it tentatively but stared back at Becca with what looked like guilt and embarrassment. Suddenly it clicked. Harper Woodham? The sweet girl that Archer should have married, according to his mother. Her heart nearly stopped as the girl nodded her head miserably, looking at her feet. Harper's going to educate you on what a proper woman of means does with her days, Lavinia explained with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got ever so many appointments this afternoon. My schedule is just booked. With that, she left Harper and Becca standing in uncomfortable silence in the middle of the kitchen, like two pillars of stone. They heard the front door slam, and Harper jumped a little bit as if scared. Becca sighed. Even though this beautiful, obviously well-bred young woman was supposed to be the one married to Archer, she couldn't find it in herself to hate her. She could never hate anyone. Even Lavinia. Would you like a cup of coffee? She asked instead. Harper looked up, confused, and Becca smiled at her. Whyar aren't you being mean to me? She nearly whispered. Her voice was soft and sweet, but her stutter was so pronounced that Becca had to hide her surprise. You're the one who should be being mean to me, Becca pointed out. I'm sorry, I didn't know that you were supposed to marry Archer. Our marriage was a little unusual. There wasn't really a courtship. Harper smiled back hesitantly, humor lurking in her eyes. I know. Why you used a matchmaker. Lavinia was so mad. It's okay, though. I didn't want T to marry Archer. Not want to marry Archer? How could any woman not want to marry Archer? Becca shook her head in bemusement. I think we need that cup of coffee now. Then, we can sit down and have a nice chat. How's that sound? Harper grinned, transforming her features from simply pretty to beautiful, and nodded. Becca felt a lightness in her chest as she poured cups of coffee for both of them. She was already so lonely in this big old house, even though Jackie was a sweetheart. It would be nice to have a friend in this scary new life, and oddly, it looked as though Archer's supposed intended bride was going to be just that. Once Harper relaxed, her stutter was nearly unnoticeable. Miss Lavinia doesn't even know about my speech impediment, Harper confessed almost immediately, kicking off her ballerina flats and pulling her legs up under her to sit cross-legged at the table. She's so domineering, she's never let me get a word in edgewise. Otherwise, she'd probably have figured out I'm not worthy of her precious boy. How is it that Lavinia, Becca stopped herself. She'd almost said, got her claws into you, but changed her mind. Picked you for Archer? Harper's face clouded and she took another delicate sip of her coffee. She talked to my father, he's nouveau rich. Not considered quite as good as the blue bloods of Asheville, since he was poor before he invented the car part that made him millions. When Lavinia said she'd find me a husband, he was relieved to let her have me. He wants me to marry well and is afraid I won't be able to because I get tongue-tied. Becca laughed. That's what my grandma says about me. That I'm tongue-tied. My grandma says a lot of things. She also told Dr. Lachele, my matchmaker, I wanted a rich guy. That was the furthest thing I'd wanted. I told Dr. Lachele I wanted a nice widower with lots of kids. Harper relaxed again. I could tell you were kind of shy, too, but you seem so much stronger than me. Doesn't Archer make you nervous? He's so intimidating. Not yet. Becca blushed and fiddled with her own coffee mug. Except he's so handsome. It's hard to think straight or remember to be shy around him. She thought about the way he kissed her and felt her cheeks burn a little hotter. How long were his work days anyway? When would she get to see him? Would he kiss her again tonight? She'd have to find out what time he got up in the morning, so she could see him off to work. Harper cleared her throat, probably not for the first time. Sorry, Becca grinned. Jackie poked her head around the doorway. I see the Rolls-Royce is gone. Is the witch gone, too? When she saw Harper at the table, her eyes went wide. I mean. Harper just nodded solemnly, a smile teasing the corner of her lips. She's gone. Want some coffee? Jackie blew out a relieved breath and hurried to sit down at the table, the wooden chair creaking under her weight. Hon, you scared the life out of me. I'm too old to find another job, and Miss Lavinia would just love to give me the pink slip. Becca brought Jackie a fresh cup of coffee. What happens in the kitchen stays in the kitchen. And, speaking of kitchens. Harper, do you want to learn how to make homemade bread? Archer pulled up under the portico, gravel crunching under the tires of his car, and sighed tiredly. What a day. Not for the first time, he wished he could leave it all behind and run away to Bora Bora. He rubbed at the back of his neck, where the muscles felt like knotted rope. It was almost 11 o'clock, and the house was mostly dark, which wasn't unusual. What was different was that there was a light glowing through the rain on the main floor, beaming a welcoming light into the darkness. Becca. Unconsciously, his step quickened, and he forgot about the headache brewing behind his eyes. The house was quiet, no noise from the TV, and he sniffed the air. Jackie must have made bread. And, was that cinnamon? His stomach growled, but he dropped his laptop case and his coat on a table in the foyer, kicked off his shoes, and headed for the living room. Becca was curled up on the couch like a kitten, her blonde hair gleaming with reddish highlights from the glow of the fireplace. He felt a smile crease his face and walked soundlessly across the thick Aubusson carpet. Her lashes shadowed her cheeks, long and thick and just a little darker than her hair. He watched her sleep for a moment, wondering if he should leave her or wake her, when those lashes fluttered, and her eyes focused on him. "Archer," she said sleepily, smiling up at him. "I'm so glad you're home." That sleepy smile did it. He was toast. "You look like Sleeping Beauty," he said, his voice husky. "Can you close your eyes again, so I can kiss you awake?" She smiled at him and closed her eyes. He knelt down beside the couch and brushed his lips over hers. Once. The tension of the day melted away. Twice. Her lips warmed under his. A third time. And her arms came up to hold him close. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. This beautiful, enchanting woman was his wife. It made him dizzy for a moment. And, suddenly, he wanted more than anything to make her his in every way. "I know we haven't known each other long, but we're married. May I take you upstairs?" He broke away long enough to ask. "I can't think of anything I'd like more right now." Her blue eyes sparkled in the dim light from the dying fire, and her lips curved in an innocently sensuous grin. "Please do." When Archer lifted her in his arms, the butterflies in Becca's stomach fluttered triple time. "I've never done this before," she added, clutching Archer's shoulders for balance as he moved swiftly up the stairs. He gave her a wicked grin and a wink, nudging his bedroom door open with one shoulder. He tossed her gently into the center of the bed, and she laughed as she bounced once on the cool, green bedspread. "That makes two of us," he answered. "I guess we'll have to figure it out together." Chapter 5. Archer winced at the sound of the alarm. 5 o'clock came far too early. He rolled over to shut it off and encountered a warm shape next to him in the darkness. His wife. She was curled on her side and sleeping as soundly as a kitten. Turning off the annoying beeping so she wouldn't wake up, he gave in to a moment of weakness and nuzzled his face into Becca's hair. She smelled like fresh apples and made a sweet sighing noise as he pressed against her back. Her skin was smooth and sleep-warmed, and he didn't want to go anywhere, but he had responsibilities, and an early morning snuggle wasn't one of them. He tried to sneak out of bed without waking her, but when he came out of the bathroom after showering, dressed and ready for the office, she was sitting up in bed, her hair falling in tousled waves over her shoulders, glimmering in the soft light from the bedside lamp. She'd pulled the covers up over her breasts modestly, but the creamy glow of her shoulders made him want to climb back into bed and kiss her until he'd memorized her taste, her feel. "Good morning," she whispered, smiling shyly. Becca felt her cheeks heat in a blush as she looked at Archer, handsome and severe-looking in his perfectly tailored business suit, his dark hair still damp and combed back from his angular face. He hadn't seemed so intimidating when they were rolling around on his giant, comfortable bed, locked together in passion the night before. Now, he looked like a stranger again. Until he smiled, melting her instantly into a needy puddle. "You look like an angel, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. There's no need to get up so early." "Oh, I'm normally an early riser." She leaned over the side of the bed, searching for the robe he'd taken her out of the night before. It was crumpled half under the bed, a messy pile of faded pink terry cloth. She shrugged into it and hopped up. Archer frowned at her ratty robe for a moment. "I thought my mother was supposed to take you out shopping yesterday." Oops. She hadn't gone shopping the day before. Instead, Becca, Jackie, and Harper had enjoyed a long afternoon of baking and laughing and cementing a firm new friendship. "Oh, I don't need." "You do." Archer was insistent. "I'll have your card delivered this morning and leave a credit card on the table. You need to start accepting that part of being a haze is dressing the part." "I'll send my mother over." "No. I mean, don't bother her," Becca hurried to say, heading for the doorway in hopes of changing the subject. "Can I fix you a cup of coffee before you leave?" She was halfway down the stairs already when he laughed. "No, sweetheart. I always stop at Starbucks on my way into town." Becca headed into the kitchen, her bare feet cold on the tile floor. "How about some toast? Jackie made your favorite bread yesterday." Before she could get the toaster down from the cupboard, she felt his arms slide around her waist. Archer kissed the side of her neck, and goosebumps rippled over her skin. She made a contented, purring sound before she could stop herself, and he groaned. "I'm fine. I'll get something at the office." He turned her around and kissed her, tasting like peppermint. "Now, I've got to go before I drag you back upstairs. I'll see you tonight." But, she'd been going to ask him what time he'd be home, so she could cook dinner for him, but it was too late. Archer was gone. She was all by herself again in a big, empty house, already wishing the day was over so she could see her husband again. Their days quickly fell into a pattern for the first 2 months. Despite Archer's insistence that Becca sleep in, she always got up to see him off in the mornings. She would then wait until Jackie showed up for their morning coffee, and the two of them would tackle the house chores and baking or cooking for the day. Sometimes Harper would join them, though she made them promise to hide her under a bed if Lavinia showed up. Instead of a rusted-out Ford Taurus station wagon, Becca now had an apple-red Mini Cooper, with black and white racing stripes, no less, that she was still too afraid to drive. It had shown up on the second full day of her marriage, and Becca begged Jackie to move it around once in a while, so Archer's feelings wouldn't be hurt that she hadn't used his gift yet. But what if she hit a deer? Or slid off the road on a patch of ice? She was even scared it would get bumped and scratched by a shopping cart at the grocery store. That zippy little car cost more than her parents' whole house. She'd gotten around Archer noticing her clothes by asking Harper to take her into Asheville. She'd picked up 3 new pairs of jeans with no holes in them, fur soft sweaters in pretty colors, new cute shoes, pajamas, socks, and underwear, and a new robe. Since she'd gone to an outlet store, the total was only $250. She still felt guilty about the expense, but at least she could tell Archer that she didn't need Lavinia's help buying anything. Not that Archer noticed whether she was wearing new clothes or potato sacks. He was out of the house by 5:30 in the morning and didn't usually get home until after 10 o'clock. And as soon as he came through the door, they usually headed upstairs right away. Archer teased that they'd both waited so long for each other, they should make up for lost time every chance they got. Becca was in love with her husband. There was no doubt about that, and it was even starting to seem like he might love her back. They definitely had fun together, even if it was only at night. But, she thought in frustration, she hadn't really spent enough time with him to find out. And she was going insane with boredom. She missed her family. She missed Emily. Spring was coming, and she wanted to see her side of the mountains, with all the rhododendrons in bloom. She wanted to show them to Archer. When he came home that evening, she was sleeping soundly on the couch. She woke to his warm hand caressing her cheek. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured. "Busy day?" She laughed tiredly. Her day had consisted of baking a batch of cookies with Jackie and doing the weekly dusting. Hardly busy. She wasn't sure why she was so sleepy. Normally she had no problem waiting up for Archer. She held his hand as they climbed the stairs together, a warm feeling suffusing her chest. It was always so good to see him, especially when their time together was so brief. "I don't know why I'm so tired," she admitted. "I didn't do much today." He led her into the bedroom, and she sat down on the bed. The mattress sank under his weight as he settled beside her to undo her braid. It had become part of their nightly routine. He loved the feel of her hair beneath his fingertips. So silky and fragrant. "You're not sick, are you?" he asked, suddenly concerned. Becca was so fair-skinned, but lately, he realized, she'd been even paler than usual. "Oh, no. Just tired. May I ask you for something?" Her sweet face was serious, and he felt a pang of dread. Their marriage had been perfect so far. Was something wrong? Of course. "Do you need money?" To his experience, money solved everything for everyone. Whenever any of his relatives came to him with a problem, a check always took care of the issue. "No. I was just wondering." "Well, hoping, really." Becca twisted her fingers in her lap, playing with the ring that he'd placed there just a couple of months before. It seemed like they'd been together forever already, and it occurred to him that, whatever it was, he'd get it for her. Becca meant the world to him, and he didn't want to remember how lost and lonely he'd been without her. Whatever it is. Just tell me. She raised her head, her blue eyes shining hopefully in the lamplight. Can we go home? You and I? I want to spend time with you. I want you to get to know my family. Meet my friends. Show you the place I grew up. Just for a few days? A week, maybe? Instantly, a denial sprang to his lips. He had a board meeting next Tuesday. He had an upcoming seminar to prepare for, and he was presenting. Hayes Investments was coming into the end of their fiscal quarter, not to mention that it was nearing tax time, their busiest season. He hadn't said a word when her face fell. Yes, he found himself saying anything to put that enchanting smile back on her lips. I'll make the arrangements, and we'll go on Monday. It would mean a very long, work-packed weekend, for him, but he realized suddenly that he actually wanted to make this happen. Really? Becca's face lit with joy, and she tackled him, knocking him backward on the bed and winding her arms on his neck while she rained kisses on his face. I can't wait. I want to see Granny Jones and my mom and dad, and you and Brody, Emily's husband, will get along great. Maybe Emily's baby will be born while we're there, Becca squealed. Plus, I already checked the forecast. We can do some hiking, the weather's supposed to be beautiful. Thank you. Archer rolled her over so quickly she squealed, pinning her beneath him. You, my wife, are too easy to please. Thank you. And he proceeded to show her just how much she meant to him. Not in words, but in the only way he knew how. "'Bout time you brought my grandbaby to see me," Granny Jones huffed. She smacked her cane down with a thump for emphasis and nearly took off Archer's pinky toe. He hugged her quickly and jumped backward, out of the range of the cane, but he wasn't bothered by Granny's antics. You're right, he grinned. Between all the work on my plate at the office and my demanding new wife, I just haven't had a minute to myself, much less time to plan a getaway. Granny, Becca hurried to placate the old woman. Archer works so hard, you have no idea. Wait, what? I'm demanding? She rounded on him, hands on her hips, but his eyes were sparkling with a teasing glint, and she huffed. Becca's mom laughed. You two certainly seem happy, her dad grunted in agreement. He was a man of few words, but he saw the happiness radiating from his daughter. If Archer put that glow on her face, that was good enough for him. Dinner capped off a wonderful first day of their vacation. Becca's family were settled around the dinner table, the late afternoon sun shining in through her mom's faded, but clean curtains, sipping after-dinner cups of coffee. Her brothers and Archer were deep in discussion about baseball, since opening day was approaching, and she grinned when the topic turned to cars. Her brothers wanted to drive Archer's. They headed out to the driveway to be manly and talk about motors. Becca offered to help her mom clear the table. She'd worried that pot roast wouldn't be good enough for Archer, but he'd cleaned his plate twice over and turned down thirds only because he said he was saving room for dessert, her mom's famous caramel cake. No, hon, she'd said. Keep your granny company. Your dad will help me. Her dad grumbled good-naturedly but hefted himself to his feet and started clearing the table. Becca helped Granny Jones to the living room and her favorite chair and settled a patchwork quilt over her knees. So, girly, her grandma cackled as soon as she was seated to her satisfaction, her eyes sharp on Becca's face. You didn't waste any time, did you? Becca cocked her head and sat down in the worn recliner beside her. What do you mean? Gettin' pregnant. Becca bobbled her coffee cup so hard at that she sloshed a little bit of the hot liquid on her jeans. Granny just handed her a handkerchief and nodded knowingly. You've got the look about you. I can always tell, she added sagely. My grandmother on my father's side had a bit of the second sight. It was true. Granny always predicted babies with amazing accuracy. Becca's mind raced, calculating, as she sat back in her chair. She felt dizzy. Her periods were never what you'd call predictable, but now that she thought about it, her last one had been the week before her wedding. She'd been terrified at the time, afraid Aunt Flo wouldn't leave town quickly enough and she'd end up having an embarrassing accident and ruin her wedding day. Aunt Flo hadn't made an appearance since. Took you by surprise, didn't I? By my figuring, I should have a great grandbaby to dandle on my knee around about Christmas. She beamed, showing off her gleaming white dentures. Congratulations. A baby? Becca's heart thumped uncomfortably. She wanted children so badly, but now? She and Archer were just discovering what this marriage thing was all about. Was it such a good idea to throw a child into the mix? They could afford a houseful of babies. But, she thought with a pang, would she basically be a single mother? Archer worked so much. They could afford those babies financially, but she wasn't sure their marriage could handle the weight of them. But Granny Jones was still watching her intently, so she pasted on a brilliant smile. A baby is a blessing, she decided. And babies come on God's time schedule. I was just surprised, is all. Please keep it a secret for a little while, though. I want to plan something special for when I tell Archer. The rest of their time together in Tennessee flew by too quickly. The idea of being pregnant was always at the back of Becca's mind, when they were hiking in her beloved Smoky Mountains, the rhododendrons blooming around them. When they were with Emily and Brody, admiring their small herd of thoroughbreds. When they got a call later that night, at 3 a.m. that Emily was in labor and reached the hospital just in time to meet little Jenny Joy, an adorable, chubby-cheeked, wailing newborn with a shock of bright red hair. Becca plotted and planned. Maybe she'd do it on their last day of vacation? Ask Archer to take her to a fancy restaurant. No, that wasn't her style. A picnic? She wished she knew if he wanted children, but they'd just never talked about it. She was still trying to decide on Thursday, when their vacation came to an abrupt end. Archer wanted to ignore the phone buzzing in his pocket, but he pulled the phone out and read the display out of habit. Sorry, he whispered apologetically to Becca. She just smiled distractedly, browsing through hand-sewn quilts and artfully designed coffee mugs at the artisan craft store he'd stopped at. The yelling on the other end of the phone gave him an instant headache. His mother. He took the call outside, listened to her ranting about him leaving work unattended and not letting her know. She broke the news that she had gone into the office and fired his secretary, since the girl had a snippy attitude. That made him angry, but not too angry. She'd already fired Jessica 3 times before and never seemed to realize she was firing the same person. It had become sort of an in-office joke. He'd just call and offer her the job back, with a salary increase for her time and trouble. Jessica looked forward to being fired by his mother. He was sure she'd be laughing as she waited for him to hire her again. But when Lavinia, still a major shareholder in the company, had called a meeting of the board without him, his anger jumped to fury. She'd done it, she said, because of concerns that his recent marriage was affecting his job performance. I'll be home tomorrow, he finally said, cutting her off mid-rant. We'll talk about this then. He disconnected the call, feeling like throwing the phone to the ground and grinding it beneath the heel of his brand-new hiking boot. This week had been amazing. Archer was falling a little more for his sweet wife each day, and seeing her with her family and friends, comfortable in the little area of the mountains where she'd grown up, he felt like he was really getting to know her as a person. And now, he thought in disgust, going back into the shop to find Becca, he was going to have to cut their trip short. She was chatting quietly with the older woman behind the counter when he found her, and they both looked up from a pretty quilt spread over the counter when he approached. Becca's eyes immediately went to his face, and he just managed to glimpse the hint of disappointment that crossed her features. Duty calls? She asked Archer, making an effort to keep her voice light. It was obvious from his face that the phone call hadn't been a good one. She looked down and ran her fingers over the wedding ring quilt she'd fallen in love with. It would look incredibly out of place in her rich new surroundings, but she couldn't help coveting it a little. Yeah, he grumbled. I'm sorry, Becca. That's all right, she said, smiling at him. It wasn't his fault. He looked so regretful. I'm starting to miss Jackie's cooking. He put a strong arm around her and squeezed gratefully. Does my wife want this quilt? he asked the saleswoman, throwing a teasing smile at Becca. The saleswoman grinned at him widely, showing a space where a molar used to be. I think she does, sir. It's one of my best. She raised her hands, gnarled with age and hard work. And worth every bit of money I charge. Takes real effort to make these wedding ring quilts the old-fashioned way. Over Becca's protests, he told the woman to box up the quilt. I'll pay you 3 times what you're charging, he told her. You do beautiful work. He couldn't give Becca the rest of the vacation he'd promised her, but if he could, he'd buy her the moon. Chapter 6. I'm sorry, sweetheart, Archer said for maybe the 5th time as they pulled under the portico. The skies had opened up on their drive home, and the cloudy sky lit up briefly with a flash of lightning. Don't apologize, Becca said. I know how hard you work. And we did get 4 days away. I had a wonderful time. Archer smiled at her tenderly and touched her cheek. You're so sweet and understanding. Becca didn't feel sweet at the moment, but she knew that she didn't want to argue with her husband either. Can I ask you for one more favor? Sure. Is there any way you'll be home in time for dinner tonight? Around 7-ish? I have a surprise for you. Archer grinned wickedly. A surprise? Count on me. I'll be home by 7. He pulled her bags out of the trunk and set them in the foyer for her. Becca kissed him goodbye and stood under the overhang as she watched him drive away, sad that their honeymoon was officially over and exhausted now that she was back home. Her little red and white room was calling her. She kicked off her shoes and took her small bags upstairs. The house was quiet, Jackie wasn't expecting them back for another few days, and they had given her the time off to go spend with her own family in Chattanooga. Her room soothed her as it always did, warm and welcoming and whimsical, with the feminine, pretty colors and the rain tapping gently against the glass. Archer teased her for insisting it was still hers, since she'd only spent 1 night in it, but having a place for herself was lovely after having shared a bedroom at home all her life, and she used it for the occasional nap or reading. Now, she spread the new wedding quilt across the bed. It had red and white in the pattern, and surprisingly, it fit right in with the room's decor. Becca set an alarm on her phone and crawled into bed, pulling the beautiful quilt up to her ears. Being pregnant, she was starting to realize, meant being tired all the time, and it was heavenly just to relax. Moments later, lulled by the growl of thunder moving off to the distance, she was asleep, her hand cupped over her belly. Archer's afternoon wasn't nearly as peaceful as Becca's. The closer he got to the office, the more he felt his shoulders tensing. He'd been able to put his business out of his mind for the last few days, but now, the stress was rolling back at him in waves. Why couldn't his mother leave well enough alone? He'd been married to Becca more than 2 months now, and it was like she didn't even acknowledge his marriage. She was still stopping by the office to stir things up, making snarky comments about his ill-bred wife. At least she'd stopped parading Harper in front of his nose. Who knew what the poor girl felt about his mom's plotting? She never said a word. She wasn't strong, like his wife. That thought gave Archer an uncomfortable feeling. Was his wife really strong? Dr. Lachele seemed to think she was, or she never would have matched them, but so far, his Becca seemed sweet and yielding. She never raised her voice. Never voiced a complaint. She always seemed to do what he asked of her without question. Except drive the car he'd bought for her. Archer chuckled as he turned into the driveway of Hayes Investments. He knew she hadn't driven it. There were only 16 miles on the odometer. Of course, he noticed she moved it around. One day it would be parked in the detached 3-car garage. Another day it would be in the driveway. But it was obvious the little Mini Cooper had never left the property. Becca was unused to a life of luxury. She'd adjust eventually. Thoughts of Becca were pushed out of his mind as soon as he entered the building. His secretary, hired back already, met him at the doors with a worried expression and a handful of phone messages. From there, it was a downward spiral. Lavinia had been very busy while he was gone. He spent 2 hours on the phone just placating the other shareholders. Yes, he was back from vacation. No, he wasn't planning on abandoning his place as CEO and moving to Idaho. Yes, he was still fully capable of running the multi-million-dollar company, and no, being married hadn't caused him to go soft. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for 5 o'clock, and Archer's head was pounding by 4. He was on his 4th cup of coffee when his cousin Derek showed up, full of bluster and swagger. Derek didn't bother to knock, but then, he never did. "Hey, Arch," Derek drawled, sinking down into a chair across from Archer's desk and crossing one leg casually. He was tall and handsome, dark-haired like most of the Hayes family, and spoiled rotten. "I heard your mama's been sounding the war drums." "What do you need, Derek?" Archer asked tiredly. "I've got my hands full here." "Why don't you just hand everything over to me, cousin? Did you hear I just finished up my degree? I can take over the family biz, and you can run off and enjoy your backwoods bride." Archer's eyes narrowed. "That's my wife, Becca, you're speaking of. Show some respect." Derek's dark eyes flashed at the sharp reprimand, but he smiled negligently. "Sorry, didn't mean to rile you up. Is that all you came for? To ask me to hand this 70-year-old company over to a wet-behind-the-ears finance graduate? Or did you need another loan?" Archer asked pointedly. Derek shrugged. "Just a couple thousand ought to do it. Dad's cut me off for the month. And I've got bills." Derek lifted one arm to glance at a shiny new Rolex that gleamed on his wrist. Archer pulled out his checkbook and scribbled off a check for $10,000. He pushed it across the desk roughly, and Derek caught it before it fluttered to the ground. "Thanks, cuz." He winked, sauntering out. Archer sighed, pulling together his notes for the meeting. Sometimes he wished he could just hand the company over to Derek. It would either make or break the younger man, and either way, Archer could do something else with his life. Hayes Investments was a ball and chain around his ankle. Since the day had turned chilly, Becca decided that a nice, thick beef stew would be the perfect meal. She already had the fragrant dinner bubbling away on the stove and was putting together the dough for her granny's famous light-as-air biscuits. The way to a man's heart was through his stomach, after all. Flour tickled her nose, and she brushed at it with the back of her hand. Humming along with the country music song on the radio, she tried to decide how best to tell Archer he was going to be a daddy. "Hon, I've got big news. I'm pregnant." How would he react? She was so deep in thought, she didn't hear anything other than the music until Lavinia's sharp voice shook her out of her daydreaming. "I knew it. You just couldn't leave the menial labor to the staff, could you?" Becca jumped, looking up. Lavinia stood in front of her, dressed to the nines in a red suit and heels. Her hair was curled and shellacked into submission, and her blue eyes were narrow and mean-looking. Next to her was a slightly younger woman who looked similar enough to be her sister. She had darker hair, brown with blonde frosted highlights, but the aristocratic tilt of her nose and a pursed mouth made Becca think that they must be sisters. "I told you, Lorena. My darling son has lost his mind. This little upstart thinks she can just climb right out of the hay cart and into the lap of luxury, and then she doesn't even have the decency to act like a Hayes woman should." Becca gasped. She felt her face flush with anger and opened her mouth to argue, but the other woman spoke first. "You're so right, Lavinia. Is that a sweatshirt she's wearing? And jeans?" She gave a disapproving sniff and a delicate little shudder, brushing at her powder blue slacks. "I wouldn't be caught dead." Becca found her voice, though it was shaky. "Can I help you ladies with something? Like a boot in the behind?" She thought to herself. "Right off the side of a mountain? Ladies. That's right. At least you recognize your betters." Lavinia's lips curled in a malicious smile. "I just wanted to give you fair warning, dear. I'm going to talk my son into annulling this ridiculous farce of a marriage. He needs a suitable wife. You just don't fit the mold of what a Hayes woman should." "Now, Harper." Lavinia sighed. Harper would have made a lovely wife. Breeding, beauty, wealth of her own. "No. I'm afraid you're just a mistake that needs to be rectified." She and Lorena left, chattering together and laughing, and Becca looked down, realizing she'd pounded the delicate biscuit dough into an unrecognizable lump. The biscuits would be hard as hockey pucks if she baked them now. A tear splashed the back of her hand. She carefully wiped her hand dry on a dish towel. She'd just have to start over, that's all. Archer would be home from work soon, and this dinner, and the announcement that came with it, had to be perfect. Responsibility was a weight that felt like about £1,000,000. Archer left the office at 10, feeling flattened by it. Every moment of the emergency board meeting felt like an hour, and now, he just couldn't wait to get home to his undemanding bride. And then he remembered she asked him to be home at 7. He lifted one hand from the steering wheel to rub his temples and told himself that Becca wouldn't mind. Becca never complained about anything, she was everything that was sweet and understanding. The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway, looming in the night like a crouched beast. He felt a pang of concern. Without fail, Becca always left the living room light on for him. He fumbled for his keys and unlocked the door. He smelled something delicious, rich and beefy, and wondered if Jackie had come home early but bypassed the kitchen to check the living room, turning lights on as he went. Becca wasn't on the couch or in any of the other rooms on the main floor. She'd looked so tired that afternoon, he wouldn't have blamed her for going to bed. But she wasn't in their bed. He looked out the stairwell window, her car was parked in its usual spot. He was starting to panic when he opened the door to her little red and white room and saw a mound of blankets. "Becca?" Archer said quietly, a little irritated after having been so nervous when he couldn't find her. She stirred and sat up, clicking the lamp switch on the bedside table. "Archer, where were you?" Her face was pale in the darkness, and her blue eyes seemed bigger than usual. Her hair was twisted into a long braid that hung over her shoulder. She wasn't smiling. "What are you doing in here?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, but his wife should be in his bed. "Not a spare bedroom." "I waited for hours," she said instead. "Where were you?" "I needed you." "Great." Looked like today was his day to let everyone down. "I was working. You know, paying for this beautiful lifestyle you married into." Becca gasped, stung at his cold tone. He acted like she'd married him for his money. "What do you mean by that?" "Forget it," Archer said dully. "I'm going to bed. It's been a long day." "Wait," Becca blurted, climbing out of bed and pulling on her robe, not noticing it was the old terrycloth one she couldn't bear to get rid of. It was too comfortable. She followed him out into the hallway. "Aren't you hungry? I can reheat the stew." "That's okay. Jackie's stew always tastes even better the second day." Becca felt the first real tickle of anger at the back of her throat. "This isn't Jackie's stew. It's mine." Archer shrugged out of his suit coat and draped it over the back of a chair. "Well, maybe we can have it for dinner tomorrow instead. I needed to tell you something, though, and I'd hoped." "That'll have to wait for tomorrow, too." He loosened his tie and unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt. Becca surprised herself. "No, it can't wait." She stomped her foot. "It's important. Your mother stopped by today." That wasn't what she meant to say, but it didn't seem the right time to tell him about the baby. Archer looked over at her, his eyes narrowed. And she was horrible." "So?" That one word felt like a dagger in her heart. "Don't you care that she's treated me like dirt?" "Look," Archer burst out, "I've had a long day trying to solve everybody's problems, and I don't have any more energy for this. If you have a problem with the way my mother acts, it's your responsibility to tell her so. Dr. Lachele promised me a strong wife, and that means someone who doesn't curl up in a ball and hide every time her mother-in-law comes around." Becca reeled back as if he'd slapped her. "You honestly don't care that she constantly comes around and tells me I'm the worst mistake you ever made? Embarrasses me for being a Tennessee hillbilly? Says that you should have married Harper or one of the other girls she picked out for you? Tell her off, then," he shot back. "Or aren't you strong enough?" "And if I'm not?" she demanded, hurt to her core. Archer shrugged, simultaneously guilty about the hurt written all over her face and angry at the world for being against him today. "Maybe I should have married someone else, then." just married a woman she picked out for me. Things would be a heck of a lot more peaceful right now, I'm sure. You don't mean that, Becca whispered. You wish I was a different person? Archer sighed wearily. Right now, I wish everything was different. Without another word, he went into the bathroom and closed the door behind him, leaving Becca standing motionless in the middle of their room. She wanted to run away. She wanted to break down and cry. She wanted to scream at him to come back and talk to her like a man, a real husband, would. She didn't do any of those things, though. Becca gathered her robe around her, turned around, and went back to her own room. Archer could sleep by himself tonight. She was going to her little sanctuary room to lick her wounds. Archer showered, hoping the hot, steamy spray would wash the aftereffects of the day away. He was so exhausted and couldn't face the thought of getting up the next day to do it all over again. Not only that, but he'd shared his rotten mood with Becca of all people. The most caring, even-tempered, non-judgmental woman he'd ever met. He winced at the memory of some of the things he'd said to her as he worked shampoo into his hair. He owed her an apology. He should also do something about his mother. Becca was right. It wasn't fair that Lavinia should be making her life miserable, too. The thought of dealing with his mother, though, was almost worse than the thought of going back to work the next day. He'd have to do it, though, he thought, shutting off the shower and wrapping a towel around his waist. She was getting out of control. He stepped out into the bedroom, ready to apologize to Becca, but she wasn't there. He'd been sure she'd be in bed, waiting for him, and realized she must be sleeping in the room next door. Archer sighed and pulled on a pair of pajama bottoms. He'd deal with it all tomorrow. His last thought before he fell asleep was that Becca had said she had a surprise for him. He wondered what it was. Chapter 7. Archer didn't sleep well. He didn't deserve to sleep well, he told himself the next morning in the pre-dawn light, getting up and getting dressed to go to work. He'd taken out his bad day on Becca, spoiled whatever surprise she had for him, and basically alienated the only person that had firmly been in his corner for as long as he could remember. Becca wasn't up and waiting with a smile like she usually was when he went down to the kitchen, and his regret and guilt doubled until he was feeling almost panicky, a completely alien emotion to him. He was Archer Hayes. He handled every issue that came his way. Then, why couldn't he make himself go wake Becca up and apologize to her? He'd messed up. Bad. Before he completely realized what he was doing, he pulled his wallet out and found the matrimony card Dr. Lachele had given him and was dialing her cell phone number. He didn't stop to think about the fact that it wasn't even 5:30 in the morning. He needed advice, fast. Becca heard Archer's voice downstairs and jumped out of bed, pulling on her robe. She'd exhausted herself crying last night and slept through her alarm. She'd meant to talk to Archer, get everything straightened out before he left for work. She knew he was under a lot of stress, and she was willing to apologize, just this once, to make sure everything was okay between them before he left for another long day at the office. She could try a redo of the night before. Make something else special for dinner. Maybe baby-themed cupcakes for dessert? But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped, curious as to who he was talking to so early in the morning. She's just not used to this kind of life, Archer was saying. I don't know what to do. Becca's so sweet and innocent. Did I make a mistake? A mistake? Becca put her hand over her mouth to stop the question from coming out. She backed up the stairs slowly, her hand on the railing. Was Archer trying to say he'd made a mistake in marrying her? What if he was talking to his mother? What if he wanted an annulment? Becca turned and hurried up the stairs, retreating to her room, the cold floor icy on her bare feet. Of course, you made a mistake, dummy. Dr. Lachele's voice had lost its sleepiness as soon as she heard who was calling. You should have stood up for Becca the day of your wedding when your mother was pulling her shenanigans. Poor Becca didn't deserve any of that. But you promised me a strong wife, Archer said defensively even though he knew the matchmaker was right. And Becca is strong. Strong and brave and kind, generous and selfless with others. Strong enough for you to fight for. Don't tell me you haven't noticed? Dr. Lachele was right. I have been a dummy, Archer admitted, restraining the urge to whack his head on the kitchen table in front of him. She's everything you've described and more. Tell me what to do to fix this. You think about how you can make this up to her, Dr. Lachele ordered tartly. Get your ducks in a row and show our girl what she means to you. In the meantime, I'm going to come right down there today and pick up Becca. She's due for a little girl time, and I think a weekend in Charleston should do the trick. Becca didn't want to get out of bed. She was tired. She was grumpy. She was mad at Archer. Her marriage might be ending before it ever completely began, and she had no reason to go anywhere right now or do anything, so she did something completely uncharacteristic. She moped. That is, until the doorbell rang at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Booby bump. Dr. Lachele? The purple-haired matchmaker stood beaming on the front steps in a plum-colored sweater and jeans, her arms thrown wide. In the flesh. Now come here and give me a hug. Becca did, astonished to see her. What are you doing here? She couldn't believe how right it felt for this woman to hold her for a minute. The booby bump was just what she'd needed. Playing fairy godmother. The other woman giggled. Get dressed, and brush that bird's nest on top of your head. We're going away for a girls' weekend. Lachele was like a velvet-covered steamroller once she got going. You either did what she said and got out of the way, or you got gently flattened. Becca was dressed and packed and tucked into Dr. Lachele's rental car before she even realized what was going on. The older woman patted Becca's knee. You try and relax and have some fun. We're going to have a great weekend, spa, mani/pedi, some new clothes. By the time we get back to town, I'm sure your husband will have a whole new outlook, trust me. Sounds fun, Becca said weakly, holding on to the doorframe as they rocketed down the road that led away from her home, but I think it's going to take more than that to fix what's wrong with my marriage. I'm not the kind of woman Archer needs as a wife. Wrong, Dr. Lachele countered cheerily, taking a turn on what felt like two wheels. You're exactly what Archer Hayes needs. She breezed through a stop sign, and Becca said a silent prayer for her unborn child. But his mother. Even Archer himself said I'm not the kind of wife he should have. Archer needs a prim, proper, well-bred wife suitable for his position in life. Then, let's turn you into that. See how he likes it. Dr. Lachele took her eyes from the steering wheel long enough to wink at Becca. Let's do a makeover. We'll trim you out, just like a high society broad. Haircut, wardrobe, the works. See how he likes it when he finally gets the wife his mother thinks he should have. Becca thought for a moment. What would he do if she came home a different person? Would he fall in love with her? Or would he want the old Becca back? It'd be a pretty expensive experiment, she said uncertainly. Dr. Lachele only grinned wider and pulled a silver-colored credit card out of her pocket. I found this platinum beauty in a basket on your kitchen counter. It's got your name on it. And you do know your husband is worth millions, right? He did tell me to use my credit card. I thought he meant if I needed anything, but maybe this kind of makeover is what he had in mind. Honey, we're going to find out. Becca was beginning to think that her old life, scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, working 14-hour days sometimes, was easier than being the wife of a wealthy man. She'd been poked and prodded, wrapped and scoured, filed and pruned until she wanted to scream. The snooty man who cut her hair sniffed constantly the whole time. Becca was about to offer him a tissue when she realized he didn't have a cold. He just had a lot of disapproval. She shuddered when she saw long strands of blonde hair falling to the floor. He wouldn't even let her see herself in the mirror when he was done, and Pierre Leroux was so bossy, she didn't argue. He was only 5 feet tall, but he carried very sharp scissors and waved them around in a way that made Becca nervous. Instead, Becca was forced to wait until new clothes and makeup stylists were brought. She was getting more and more antsy when Pierre did something that scared her more than anything else. He smiled. Becca. You're not going to believe the way you look. Dr. Lachele's eyes were wide. Is it that bad? Becca whispered. You were gorgeous before, and you're gorgeous now. You just look so different. Different is what we're going for. Becca squared her shoulders and turned to the three-way mirror on the wall behind her. She searched it for a moment before she realized the woman reflected back was her. No more flyaway, waist-length blonde hair. Instead, her hair was a short, sleek cap of sunny blonde, shimmering and falling in an angle to her chin. It made her eyes appear much bigger, deeper blue, and somehow exotic, although that could have been the artfully applied shadow and liner around her eyes. She looked taller, too. The short boots with heels she wore added a couple of inches to her height and were surprisingly comfortable. Tight blue skinny jeans with a couple of strategically placed rips encased her long legs, and a loose-fitting white blouse with a plunging V-neck completed the outfit. The stylist's assistant piled on about 15 silver bangles on one slim wrist and fastened a short silver chain around her neck, and one of the other members of the makeup team handed her a big leather, hobo-style bag that matched her boots. Dr. Lachele snapped her fingers. "Kristen Bell, that's who you look like. Is that a good thing?" Becca asked doubtfully. "I've never heard of her. And I don't see why we had to pay so much for these jeans. I've got some at home that are already ripped." "Trust me," Lachele winked. "Archer's not going to know what hit him." Pierre wouldn't let them leave until Becca proved that she could do the makeup exactly like the stylist showed her, and once they escaped the salon, Becca begged for a lunch break. "Salads," Lachele chuckled. "Then, it's mani/petty time. I thought Pierre was going to have a heart attack when he saw your fingernails." The rest of the weekend went by in a whirlwind, and Becca finally put the credit card in Dr. Lachele's capable hands. "I don't want to know how much all of this is costing," she said miserably. Every time Becca passed a mirror, she had to do a double take. What had happened to the shy, backwoods girl Archer had married? Becca's own granny wouldn't recognize her now. She had to admit, though, after she got used to it a little bit, she was starting to like her new look. New Becca looked like a woman who wouldn't be afraid to stand up to an interfering mother-in-law. She also looked like a woman who belonged with a handsome, polished, successful man like Archer Hayes. She started to walk a little more upright in her new clothes, wearing them with confidence. And under Dr. Lachele's tutoring, she began to speak with a little more volume and a little more assertiveness. By the time the weekend was over, Rebecca, the alter ego she and Lachele had agreed upon, was ready to take on Asheville and everyone in it. They decided to take a detour on the way home and try out a test run on Emily, who was settling in with little Jenny Joy. "I can't come to this part of the country without seeing my newest matrimony munchkin," Dr. Lachele insisted. They parked in the bumpy gravel drive and unloaded the trunk of the rental car. Loaded down with boxes and bags, Lachele and Becca approached the beautiful old farmhouse, laden with gifts for the new mother and baby. William, the family's surrogate grandfather, who lived in a converted apartment above Emily and Brody's garage, came hustling out to help them. "Dr. Lachele." The man grinned, showing a gleaming white, denture-bright smile. "As I live and breathe. How are you?" Lachele laughed and gave him an awkward one-armed hug while he tried to take packages out of her hands. "I'm doing just wonderful, William. Are you ready to be my next client yet?" "Oh, no, I'm a confirmed bachelor for life." He laughed and then turned to Becca. Even though Becca had been Emily and Brody's housekeeper for over a year, there wasn't even a flicker of recognition in his faded brown eyes. "And who might you be?" He grinned in a friendly way. "Are you Dr. Lachele's newest customer? She'll have a lot more luck pairing you off than she would a crusty old man like me." "Oh, she already did." "You mean you don't recognize me?" Becca laughed. William squinted at her, and his jaw dropped. "Becca? What in the world happened to you? I thought you was that movie star, what's her name? Kristen Bell?" Dr. Lachele's laughter was loud enough to bring Brody out of the barn and Alec running from the woods. "Wait until Emily sees you," she gasped out through giggles. "If your best friend doesn't recognize you, your husband doesn't stand a chance." Chapter 8. The nervousness that Becca felt in showing her friend her new persona was nothing compared to the butterflies that battled in her belly the next day, knowing that her husband was coming home to a whole different woman. Emily had squealed and carefully danced Becca around the kitchen. I cannot believe I missed this. Becca, you're like one of those before and after makeover shows, except before was beautiful and after is just beat a fleur. If I weren't so happy, I'd hate you right now. And you, Dr. Lachele, how could you? You couldn't have waited 2 weeks until I was recovered from birthing my behemoth baby, so I could come along to Charleston? Sorry. Lachele grinned, cuddling the very chubby and very cute Jenny Joy to her happily. She ran her purple-tipped fingers gently over the baby's head, smoothing her bright red hair, as her new munchkin watched her owlishly with her bluish-colored newborn eyes. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and we had to move quick. You get yourself all recovered and settled into new mom life, and we'll do this again in the fall. I haven't had so much fun in years. It might have to become a semi-annual tradition. Holding Emily's beautiful baby, Becca felt her heart squeeze. Right now, deep in her womb, a little baby boy or girl was growing and changing, and in 8 or 9 months, depending on what her doctor had to say next week, she, too, would have her own baby to squeeze and love on. She wanted to burst with the news, but didn't feel right in sharing with Emily or Dr. Lachele or anyone else until she'd found a way to tell Archer. Then, she thought, then she'd be able to get excited about impending motherhood and celebrate. For now, she was just scared at what his reaction might be. Did Archer even want to be a father? They'd agreed to set a getaway date for some time during late summer or early fall, showered Emily's family with the gifts they'd bought while they were in Charleston, and then rocketed back toward Asheville in Dr. Lachele's rental car. Sorry, sweetie, she'd said, pulling into the drive with a shower of gravel spewing from her back tires. I'm going to miss my flight. Open the door, tuck, and roll. Thankfully, Lachele did bring the car to a full stop at least. Becca had to get all her things out of the trunk. But after a quick booby bump, Becca's purple-haired matchmaker and fairy godmother was on her way. Her tires spun for a second, gaining traction on the driveway. The car fishtailed and shot for the narrow one-lane, stone-lined drive that led to the road. Becca chuckled, shaking her head, and turned to go into the house. Seconds later, though, she heard a sharp squeal of metal on metal that seemed to last at least 10 full seconds. She spun around, in time to see Dr. Lachele's little rental car wedged in the walled drive with Archer's black Mercedes. Her hands flew to her mouth in horror. The two cars were wedged almost motionlessly together in the narrow space. Then, helpless giggles erupted as Dr. Lachele honked the horn with merry little beep-beeps, like she was oblivious to the situation she'd gotten them into. The two cars continued to inch forward, in opposite directions, screeching loudly as metal dented and paint scraped, until the smaller rental popped free. Dr. Lachele, late for her plane after all, didn't even stop. She just gave one last beep-beep, and roared out of the driveway and onto the road. The Mercedes pulled slowly under the portico, as if Archer was still in shock. She tried to get her laughter under control, forgetting all about her new appearance and how nervous she was. Archer probably was in shock. Because when he opened his driver's side door, with a new grinding sound that hadn't been there before, he looked straight at her, surrounded by all of her baggage, with confusion on his face. Can I help you with something? Becca resisted the urge to laugh again, this time a little hysterically. For better or worse, she was a new woman. She took a deep breath. Yes, please. You can help me carry these things in, Becca said smoothly. I'm home, Archer. It was gratifying to watch his eyes widen in recognition. Be Becca. What the? Archer hurried around the car, starting to hug her, but stopping. I'm, glad you're home. She felt a little pang but pasted a cool smile on her lips, and he gathered up her things. Did you have a nice weekend? She asked as they went into the house. Yeah, no. He dropped the bags in the hall and ran his fingers through his hair, leaving the dark strands sticking up messily. I missed you. I couldn't concentrate on work, and the house seemed so empty. Not to mention our bed. What's going on, Becca? I'm going by Rebecca now. Okay? Archer looked at her, really looked at her, from the top of her perfectly smooth, swingy new haircut to her outfit, expensive skinny jeans, again with ripped knees, a loose white V-neck blouse with a pendant necklace, a long cardigan in pale pink, right down to her feet in tan high heels, open-toed to show off her pedicure. She'd done her makeup, too, just as Pierre had instructed. The results were obviously baffling to her husband. "So, you went shopping with Dr. Lachele, huh?" he said weakly. "Looks like you had a makeover, too." "Yes, dear," Becca purred. "I decided it was time to look the part of a Hayes wife. Do you like it?" She did a little pirouette. Luckily, it was a graceful pirouette. Secretly, she thought she'd fall on her face. She could count on one hand the times she'd worn heels in her life. Of course. Finally, Archer seemed to get himself pulled together. The look on his face was unreadable. "You look lovely." Archer couldn't believe it. Gone was his sweet, innocent-looking Becca, and in her place was a sophisticated stranger. Even his mother would have a hard time finding fault with her appearance. Becca's long, beautiful hair had been cut short and sleek, her comfortable jeans and sweatshirts, her woolly socks, that he found so cute, gone. She looked like any number of his colleagues' wives. Serene, stylish, and rich. She'd lost whatever it was that made her so unique. She even talked differently. Her charming accent had smoothed out. What had happened? He'd thought Dr. Lachele would make Becca feel better. Less self-conscious about being different. Perk up her spirits with some girl time. Instead, she'd turned Becca into someone his mother would have picked out. Suddenly, he was irritated with the entire world. Forgotten were the plans he'd had to woo his wife, make her forgive him. Make her fall in love with him like he'd fallen in love with her. Instead, he decided he'd give his wife a little test. "I know you just got home, and you've had a busy weekend, but I have a dinner meeting tonight with a client of mine. Would you like to come with me?" Here it was, Becca thought sadly. Archer really did approve of her new persona. He'd never invited her to go to a client dinner before. Probably because he'd been embarrassed about his countrified bride. She was exhausted and a little nauseated, but she plastered a false smile on her face. "Of course, Archer. Should I change?" "No," he replied, looking at her oddly. "You've changed enough." They took Becca's Mini Cooper into town, since Archer's car was a little under the weather. It was torture, being so close to him in the cozy confines of the small car. Becca could smell Archer's cologne, and she missed him. She'd have been happier tumbling into bed with her husband, hiding under the covers, and letting the rest of the world go by. Instead, they were going out. Her disguise would be put to the test. She'd never been to a restaurant with valet parking, but as soon as Archer pulled up at the front doors, a uniformed young man hurried down to open her door for her. He rounded the car and took Archer's keys, smiling gratefully at the folded bill Archer handed him. Her husband held out an arm. "Shall we?" "Thank you," she murmured, clutching her purse tightly to her shoulder with her other hand. Nerves hummed in her belly, and she hoped she could make it through the evening without throwing up or embarrassing herself. The maitre d' greeted Archer by name and led them to a table in the back corner, where a large, older man in a business suit waited for them. Next to him was a small, plump woman dressed in a too-fancy dress and loaded down with lots of jewelry, looking shy and uncomfortable. The man stood up when he saw them coming, beaming. "Hayes, how are you?" His voice was as big as the rest of him. "Who is this ravishing young lady?" He beamed at her and shook her hand in one massive paw. She relaxed a little at the man's gruff greeting. He seemed outrageous, but friendly. Archer smiled. "Jim, meet my wife. Rebecca. Rebecca, this is Jim Jakowski, one of my favorite clients." Jim grinned and winked at Becca. "Ah, heck. He says that about all his clients." "Nice to meet you, little lady." His accent sounded Texan. "I'd heard Archer'd gotten married. Seeing you just proves he has all the luck." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Jim," she murmured with a smile. "And this here is my wife, Susie." The woman held out her hand tentatively, and Archer and Becca both shook it. Becca's heart went out to the poor woman. She looked positively uncomfortable and wishing herself anywhere else. Becca slid into the chair that Archer pulled out for her next to Susie. They ordered steaks for the men, soup and salad for Becca, who didn't think she'd be able to stomach anything else, and Susie, who followed her lead. The two women sat quietly as their husbands talked about business matters until their main course was delivered. Becca knew she should try to be more outgoing, talk to Susie, but she was feeling so miserable, she couldn't stand it. Archer wasn't paying her any attention, and she was feeling more and more piqued by the minute. When their food came, Becca took one sniff of the asparagus on her husband's plate and panicked. "You don't look so well," Susie whispered. Becca was afraid to speak. She just nodded carefully. "Here. Let's go get some fresh air." She tossed down her napkin and took Becca's arm. "We'll be right back," she said to her husband quietly. He nodded and went on talking. Archer didn't even look up, and Becca got the sudden urge to kick the back of his chair. She made it to the restroom just in time, with Susie's help. As she came out of the stall, embarrassed but feeling better, Susie was waiting with a cold, wet paper towel and a small glass of water. "Are you okay now, Mrs. Hayes?" she asked sympathetically. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you, yes." Becca gratefully took the glass of water, and Susie helped her to one of two small stools that stood in front of a little vanity table. "If you put this on the back of your neck," Susie offered, "it should help with the nausea." "May I?" Becca nodded, sipping the water until she felt better. The coldness at the back of her neck got rid of the overheated feeling, and she felt the last of the nausea ease. Susie Jakowski settled onto the stool across from her. "Is this your first?" she asked, smiling. "How'd you know?" Becca was suddenly so tired, she didn't even try to hide her Tennessee twang. Susie's eyes opened wider. "Well, I had 3 of my own," the other woman confided. "Each pregnancy was worse than the last. I promise, though." She laughed softly. "The results are worth it. If you don't mind me asking, where are you from?" "Wolf Creek. It's an almost non-existent town in Tennessee." Becca took another sip, too grateful to be feeling better to even consider moving. Susie clapped her hands, delightedly. "I know that area. My grandma grew up in Pigeon Forge." "Forgive me, but I'd have had a hard time believing it just a few minutes ago. When you showed up with your husband, I was so intimidated. You seemed so perfect and poised, I thought you surely must be Asheville born and bred." Becca smiled back, suddenly wanting to confide in the woman. Something about her reminded her of a shy version of Dr. Lachele. "Oh, no," she laughed. "I'm as much of a country girl as a girl can be. In fact," she waved her hand at the clothes she wore, "I'm more relaxed in jeans you can actually breathe in. They're much more comfortable to scrub floors in." She told Susie an abbreviated version of her story. "That is incredible. I love a good fairy tale." Susie took a tissue from the vanity counter and dabbed at her eyes. "This one even has a wicked stepmother. Or mother-in-law, I should say." Realizing that they'd been holed up in the ladies' room for quite a while and their husbands must have noticed them missing, Becca stood up slowly. Thankfully, her stomach stayed put. In fact, she was feeling pretty hungry. "I'll tell you what," her new friend said firmly. "I've got an idea. Play along when we get back to the table." The men hardly looked up from their meals when Becca and Susie came back. They were arguing in low tones over portfolio number and stock options. Susie delicately cleared her throat as she sat down. "Jim, darling," she said softly, but her big, burly husband broke off in mid-sentence and snapped to attention. "Yes, sweetheart? Sign with Hayes." He cocked his head, obviously surprised. "Of course. But why?" "I just had a meeting with Mr. Hayes's wife at length, and she's convinced me that her husband's company will be the best option to handle our investments." He blinked and nodded. Turning his attention back to Archer, who was watching the exchange with interest, he said, "Looks like you've got a new client. I look forward to working with you. Your terms will be acceptable." They sealed their agreement with a handshake and got down to the real business of eating. Neither man noticed when Susie gave Becca a discreet wink and a grin. On the way home, Archer played the whole dinner over in his mind, trying to determine what had happened. He liked Jim. The man was ridiculously wealthy but down-to-earth and not a bit pretentious. However, he drove a hard bargain, and before Becca and Jim's wife had come back, Archer wasn't sure that he was going to move his investment portfolio to Hayes. With 3 words from his wife, suddenly, Jim was on board. Correction. He glanced at Becca, who was dozing in the seat beside him. With encouragement from his wife, who knew nothing about investments. He was grateful to her, of course, but what was going on? Had she taken a crash course in financial management this weekend, too? He'd invited her to dinner, expecting Becca to flounder like a fish out of water, and that was mean-spirited and petty of him. He'd just wanted to show her that she could look the part of a society wife, but it wasn't who she was. Instead, she'd netted him his biggest client in the last 5 years. He was starting to ask himself if he'd been doing Becca a disservice since marrying her. Archer rubbed his forehead. He'd been so concerned about her fitting his needs as a wife that he hadn't really considered her as a person. He'd kept her tucked away for the last couple of months, spending long nights at the office and even working weekends. She hadn't complained, just waited for him to toss her a crumb of attention occasionally. Sure, he'd taken her home to visit her family, but what else had he really done for her? Instead, she was the giving one, waking up early to see him off, when there was no need to. Always staying up late. Listening to him complain about his day. Being available whenever he wanted to make love. Archer was finally starting to face the facts. Dr. Lachele was right. He was a dummy. The woman he loved was a ruby beyond price. And now, he thought, glancing again at his sleeping wife, Becca was going even further. She'd changed her entire self just to fit the mold of what she imagined his wife should be like. Chapter 9. Becca was sleeping so deeply, she didn't even realize they were home until Archer opened the passenger side door. "SSH," he murmured gently, scooping her up in his arms as if she didn't weigh anything at all, carefully extricating her from the tiny car. He carried her up the steps and maneuvered the door open while she was still trying to clear the last wisps of sleep from her brain. Instead of setting her down, he nudged the door behind him closed with one foot and continued up the stairs. "You don't have to carry me," she protested, wriggling a little. "I can walk." "I never carried my bride over the threshold," Archer said soberly. "I should probably carry you everywhere for the next 2 months, to make up for it." He finally set her down on their bed. Of course he'd want to make love, she thought. They'd hardly missed a night since their first time together. But she was so incredibly exhausted, all she wanted to do was curl up in bed and go back to sleep. Archer switched on the bedside lamp and went into the other room. He came back with a nightgown. Then, he started to undress her like a child. "Relax," he laughed quietly, correctly reading her expression. "You're tired. I just want you comfortable." She blushed, still embarrassed to be naked in front of him even after all the time they'd spent exploring each other in this very same bed, but he just pulled her nightgown over her head. It was one of her old ones. A soft flannel, almost worn through in some places, with a high neck and ruffles at the too short hem. It probably looked pretty silly with her posh new hairdo and the makeup that she hadn't washed off her face yet, but she was too tired to care. "Can I get you something to drink or anything?" "No, thank you." Becca was perplexed. "Why are you acting so strange?" I didn't mean." "You were right. It probably is time for some changes around here." She was still thinking about his words as she cuddled sleepily under the covers. What did he mean about changing? She liked him just as he was. The next morning, Becca woke with the sun shining in her face. Crud. She'd wanted to be awake before he left. It was Monday morning, and there was no way Archer would still be home. She sniffed the air, smelling coffee and cinnamon rolls. She rolled out of bed. Jackie must be at work already. She grabbed her robe from the chair and belted it around her. Then, she looked down. It was her favorite one. Archer must have left it for her, because she knew she'd tucked it in the back of the wardrobe in her room. What was up with him? He'd acted so strangely the night before. She quickly used the bathroom and washed her face free of the makeup from the previous day. She ran a brush through her hair, too, pleased when it fell back into place, without too much work. Becca headed down the stairs, but instead of Jackie in the kitchen, her husband was at the oven, an apron wrapped around his lean waist, taking a steaming pan that smelled delicious out of the oven. He set them on top of the 6-burner gas range as she just gaped at him. Concussion? Oh, goodness. Brain tumor? What else could explain Archer baking of all things? He turned around to take off the oven mitts he wore and saw Becca standing in the doorway. Good morning, beautiful. He grinned. Archer Hayes, what is wrong with you? Why aren't you at work? He shrugged, looking like a kid who'd skipped school and was perfectly unashamed. I'll go in a little while. I wanted to have breakfast with you. Want some coffee? He gestured to the French press on the counter. It smelled so good. Maybe just a half cup, Becca said. She'd have to ask Jackie to pick up some decaf next time she went to the store. She just couldn't get by in the morning without her coffee. Sit down, Archer ordered her. I'll bring it to you. Becca did as she was told. She was too surprised not to. Her stomach growled as Archer drizzled some icing from a little bowl on the counter on top of the hot rolls. He scooped 2 onto a small plate and fixed her coffee with cream and lots of sugar, just the way she liked it. Are these Jackie's cinnamon rolls? She asked tentatively when he sat down across the table from her. Kind of sexist of you to imply that I don't belong in a kitchen just because I'm a man, he teased, forking up a bite of the roll. I didn't mean that. Archer held up a hand. I'm joking. It's no wonder you don't know I've always liked to bake. It's not like we've had a whole lot of time to really get to know each other. And they kind of are Jackie's rolls. Who do you think taught me to make them? My mother? Becca felt like she must be dreaming. It was the perfect morning. Her husband had played hooky from work to bake and was sitting across from her, his hair still tousled from bed, his cheeks dark with scruff, wearing an apron that said, "Kiss the cook" over a black t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. If she wasn't sure she was in love before, she most definitely was now. And then she realized something. Now was the perfect time to tell him about the baby. Becca opened her mouth to do just that, when she heard the clatter of high heels on tile floor, coming down the hall. Her dream had just morphed into a nightmare. It was her mother-in-law. Archer Rutherford Hayes. Why in the world aren't you at work? Mother. Archer stood. But Lavinia wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Becca, her eyes narrowed dangerously. You. I should have known. Archer, give us a moment. I don't think so. Archer stayed where he was and took a calm sip of his coffee. What do you mean, you don't think so? Lavinia's chest rose beneath her mint green sweater set. An explosion was imminent. Also, you should probably start knocking. Better yet, call if you'd like to visit. This is my house, after all. Lavinia's coral lipsticked mouth gaped open. It was not a good look for her. But, while you're here, he went on casually. I think I should tell you. I'm probably going to quit as CEO of Hayes. Lavinia was wearing pearls, and she clutched them. It was all Becca could do not to giggle. Her mother-in-law was literally clutching her pearls. You can't. Becca looked at Archer, shocked to her core. He really did have something wrong with him. No. Why? He just shrugged again, watching her carefully. Gauging her reaction to his pronouncement. Why not? I'll tell you why not. Archer's mother's shrill voice rang out. Because this backwoods little hillbilly slut has her hooks in you. Let me tell you something before you go and throw your whole life away over her. Hold on a minute. Archer shot to his feet. You've gone too far. Don't speak of my wife with that kind of disrespect. Becca hated confrontations, and this one was making her stomach suddenly churn. Before you go siding with your wife, Lavinia sneered, giving Becca a malicious look. Let me just tell you a thing or two. Harper Woodham, that sweet girl I wanted you to marry? She told me all about your little gold-digging wife. Apparently, those two have cozied up together, and Becca confided all kinds of things. How she specifically asked that matchmaker for a rich man, and you fit the bill just perfectly. Becca gasped. Harper would never have said such a thing, but she had told Harper that her granny had requested a rich guy for Becca. She felt the blood drain from her face when she thought of it. Would Harper really have told Lavinia that? Harper must have known it was a joke. Had she taken it the wrong way? Would Archer take that the wrong way? Is it true? Archer watched a variety of expressions chase across Becca's face. Disbelief, hurt, and guilt. The hope, the excitement that he'd woken up with this morning, the feeling that his life and his marriage could be whatever he and Becca wanted to make of it, drained away. Becca saw the look on his face, and fear drilled into her heart. It's not. I mean, my granny told Dr. Lachele that when she came to interview me. It's not too late, Archer, Lavinia broke in, her pale blue eyes glittering with satisfaction. You can still get an annulment. She set her voluminous Prada purse down on the counter and dug around inside. Triumphantly, she came up with a manila envelope. I've got the paperwork right here. Harper isn't suitable anymore, of course, but I already have a few more candidates lined up. Looking devastated, Archer reached for the envelope. Archer, no, you can't. Becca shot to her feet. Why not? He asked her coldly. I can sue Dr. Lachele for breach of contract. I asked her for someone who wouldn't marry me for my money. And someone strong enough to stand up for herself with my mother. Instead, I got a greedy, weak wife who only wanted a rich husband to take care of her. You went away for the weekend and came back as your real self. The haircut, the clothes. You got everything you wanted, didn't you? Becca's heart shattered. How could he think that? Believe that? Blindly, she reached out for him, knocking her coffee cup off the table. It hit the ground at Lavinia's feet, spraying sticky sweet coffee all over her mother-in-law's soft leather shoes. Lavinia shrieked. Archer ignored his mother, watching Becca dispassionately. You can't annul this marriage, she cried out, her voice broken. I'm pregnant. Becca wheeled around, pushed past Lavinia, who looked surprised, and ran from the room. She missed the stricken look on Archer's face. Archer, Lavinia said tentatively, finally really looking at her son for the first time and seeing the pain that racked him and the shock that his wife's outburst had caused him. Archer sank down into his chair, his head in his hands. In front of him, the abandoned cinnamon rolls sat, cold now, their icing congealing thickly on the plate. He hadn't baked in so long, Lavinia realized. Archer's father had always called it a girly skill. Just go, mother. I'm late for work. Lavinia backed out of the kitchen, leaving the envelope on the table next to him. She'd gotten what she'd wanted. An unfamiliar feeling stirred in her as she looked up the stairs to the second floor. She could hear Becca's broken-hearted sobbing from the main floor. Archer would drop that little fortune hunter, finally. But at what cost? What had she done? Becca lay on the pretty little red and white bed in her room. Her face felt swollen, her eyes itchy from crying. She'd heard the front door close earlier and a car pulling away. Lavinia leaving. A little while later, she'd made out the sounds of Archer moving around in the room next door. The front door slammed again after that, as she imagined him heading off to work. She stood up, shaky and weak after her emotional episode. Feeling achy and tired, like an old woman, she went to the wardrobe. She took out her brother's old high school sweatshirt and put it on with a pair of jeans. Regular, comfortable old Levis. Not the ripped-up, skin-tight ones she and Dr. Lachele had bought. She packed her suitcase. Into it went the pitifully few remaining things she'd brought with her. The new clothes stayed put. The cosmetics, most still in their boxes, she left in the bathroom. She wanted to say goodbye to Jackie and Harper, even though she didn't understand why her shy friend had betrayed her, but the need to go home, back to Wolf Creek, was too strong. She needed her parents. She needed Granny Jones. Leaving her credit card on the counter and taking only her car keys, she went out to the Mini Cooper. Tossing her small bag in the back, she slid into the driver's seat. Tears rushed to her eyes again as she smelled Archer's familiar cologne. She didn't look up at the house as she pulled away. Becca would go home and have her brothers return the car. She couldn't think beyond that or she'd shatter into a million pieces. Archer buried himself in work for the next few days, trying to forget his pain. He didn't even go home at night. He had a mostly comfortable couch in his office, and he slept there. He had Jessica, his secretary, go out and buy him a couple of things. Fresh shirts, ties. She started to tease him about eccentric rich guys that liked to pretend they were homeless, but after she got a good look at his haggard face, she changed her mind. Archer didn't want to go home. Either his wife would be there waiting for him or she wouldn't, and he didn't know which one would be worse. She had to be lying about being pregnant. He'd seen the guilt written all over her face when she admitted her grandma had arranged with Dr. Lachele for Becca to marry a rich man. She didn't love him. She'd loved his money, just like everyone else in his life. Lavinia twice came to see him, but he had Jessica turn her away. Thursday, he had a meeting with Jim Jakowski. His big, congenial new client took one look at him and whistled. "Who, boy? You're not looking so good." Archer tried to smile, but failed. "Yeah, not a great week." Jim nodded sympathetically. "I understand. My wife had the same problems with all of her pregnancies, and sometimes I felt like I'd be sick with her, just out of sympathy. It'll pass by the end of the first trimester, usually." Archer looked up at Jim, his bleary eyes suddenly intent. "What?" Jim laughed. "My wife and I have no secrets. When Susie and I were driving home after dinner the other night, she confessed that Becca hadn't really been selling her on your company that whole time they were gone. Boy, she was too busy being sicker than 3 dogs. Susie just made that up because she liked Becca and you and figured she'd be able to see Becca sometimes if we were working together." Archer rubbed his forehead, where a headache had suddenly bloomed. "Jim, I'm sorry. I think I'm going to have to reschedule our meeting." "No problem at all. Just have your secretary call mine and set something up. You should go home and get some rest. You look like you've been flattened right out." Archer had been flattened. Jim's revelation had knocked the stuffing right out of him. His wife really was pregnant. If she'd only married him for his money, why would she let herself get pregnant? Why hadn't she been on birth control? Instead of going home, Archer went someplace he'd never been. The Woodham residence. He'd had to Google the address and drive all the way across town to get there. Then, he'd had to convince the guard at the gated community of who he was and why he was there. Thankfully, the man had let him through. An English-looking butler answered the door of the impressive mansion, dressed in severe black and white. He raised an eyebrow at Archer's loosened tie and stubble-scruffed cheeks. "May I help you?" His stiff tone implied that he'd rather not. "I'm here to see Harper." "Can you tell her Archer Hayes is here?" At the mention of the name Hayes, the butler quickly thawed and led him into a sitting area, before going to fetch Harper. The petite blonde smiled shyly when she came into the room. She was dressed in tennis whites, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look about 15 years old. "How are you, Archer?" Had he realized before that Harper stuttered? Surprised, he discovered that this was the first time he'd really ever heard her speak. "I'm sorry to bother you at home," he started, but she interrupted him. "And no, I'm glad you came. Wanted to apologize for the way I acted with your mother. It's just that I consider Becca a very dear friend, and I didn't like the accusations she was making. Normally, I don't talk back to anyone, but I got a little carried away with Lavinia." She grinned, and a dimple winked in one cheek. She was so mad. "I'm not that sorry, though. It was overdue. You didn't tell my mother that Becca only married me for my money? That she told Dr. Lachele she wanted a rich man?" Harper looked horrified. "Oh, of course not. Becca told me her grandmother joked tea to Dr. Lachele about a rich man. Becca said she'd prefer a poor widower with kids. She loves kids, and why you can see for yourself how awkward she is having money and now. She's never even driven that car you bought her. I told Lavinia that. Of course, Becca loved kids. She'd told him as much when they'd visited Wolf Creek together, and she'd talked about being the only one of her cousins who hadn't had a child yet. Which was why she'd been so eager to tell him her surprise. That she was pregnant. He was more than a dummy, Archer thought miserably. He was a straight-up idiot. Chapter 10. Becca had been home for 3 days, but it felt like an eternity since she'd seen Archer. She'd rotated between tears and anger, and then complete and utter happiness after she'd left her appointment with her doctor that confirmed Granny Jones's prediction. She was 13 weeks pregnant. Then, she was back to tears again. Becca's parents had left for work, and only her Granny Jones was home to deal with Becca's emotional roller coaster. "You need to snap out of it, Missy," her grandma scolded when Becca brought her a cup of tea out onto the front porch. "That doctor of yours said your blood pressure's too high. Think of that baby you're carrying, not your dunderhead husband." Granny gummed on her dentures and scowled. "I'd like to take a switch to that boy." Becca sank down on the porch swing across from Granny Jones. Tears threatened again. "I can't help it," she told her grandma miserably. "I miss him so much. I thought for sure he'd have at least called." "Well, if you love him so dongade much, why'd you leave?" "You didn't see the look on his face. When Lavinia convinced him I'd only wanted a husband for his money, it was like his world had come to an end. It didn't though, now did it? All of this was just a big, hairy mistake." Becca sniffled. Her nose was so red and sore from countless tissues, she knew she must look horrible. "It was a mistake. But to have him not believe me. I've done nothing but try to be a good wife for Archer since I said, I do. I even cut my hair for him, changed my whole personality, and he never even said anything." "That's right." Granny Jones thumped her cane. "You're not in the wrong here, unless it's for not punching that Lavinia in her meddlin' nose before she could cause all this mess. Why does she hate me so much?" Granny pulled her paisley shawl closer around her shoulders. The weather was beautiful today, temperatures hovering in the low 70s, with buds about to burst on the trees, but her old bones felt cold no matter how hot it got. "If I had to make a guess, I'd say because you remind her of herself." Becca recoiled, looking at her grandma with horror. "What's that supposed to mean?" Granny chuckled. "I'm just saying she acts like a woman who doesn't know how to handle money. Except where you feel guilty about it, she went overboard trying to pretend she was born into that kind of life. Too much makeup, too much jewelry, treating people poorly. She didn't grow up rich. I'll bet you dollars to donuts that she was raised on means just as modest as yours." Granny looked thoughtful for a moment. "I wonder what her maiden name is. I thought the first time I saw her that she had the look of the Treacher family, from over near Tom Town. Go fetch me one of your mama's high school yearbooks and my reading spectacles." Shaking her head at her grandma's steel trap memory when she had a hard time recalling what she had for breakfast the day before, Becca did as she was asked. "I knew it." Granny Jones crowed a few minutes later, pushing her reading glasses up on her nose. She pointed one crooked finger at a black and white picture of a smiling girl with braces and Farrah Fawcett hair. "Llewellyn Treacher." It was Lavinia. "Llewellyn took up with a rich old man, Jeremiah Sutton, just out of high school," Granny said. "I remember her now, because your granddad and I used to go to church with the Treacher family over at the Del Rio Baptist for a while. There was some talk about that May-December marriage, let me tell you, but Llewellyn's mama insisted it was a love match. I heard he passed on a few years later, but I never did hear what happened to Llewellyn after that." Becca's compassionate heart softened a little toward her mother-in-law. What if she really had loved her first husband even though he'd been much older, and how difficult it must have been to get along without him at only 21 or 22 years old. She'd only been married to Archer less than 3 months, but she didn't know what she'd do if he died and left her alone. That doesn't make her behavior any less acceptable, Becca finally said. But maybe more understandable. So? What are you gonna do, girlie? Granny Jones looked at her hard. Are you gonna sit here and mope while your prince not-so-charming paces in his castle and broods worse than an ornery laying hen? Or are you going to go give him heck? The thought of facing Archer was painful, but her granny was right. She was doing neither of them any good by sitting here and crying about everything. Except for one thing. I sent the car back. How am I going to get there? Oh, is that all? Granny Jones waved her hand and chuckled. I told your brothers not to bother returning it yet and had your dad park that little toy scooter of yours back behind the shed. She got up and went to her grandma, giving her a careful hug. She was small and frail in her wicker chair, but Granny Jones was still the superglue that held the Jones family together. What would I do without you? Becca asked, a catch in her throat. Girlie, I have no idea. Her grandma laughed. But since I plan on living to 150, the good Lord willing, you'll probably never have to find out. Archer looked around at his empty shelves and desk. Events had been set in motion now. There was no going back. He winked at Jessica on his way out, and she gave him a tearful, smiling wave. He felt a lightness in his chest walking out of the Hayes investment building that he'd certainly never felt while walking into it. His mom was going to flip. His cousin quite possibly might expire in shock. The rest of his family would think he'd lost his mind. Laughing out loud as he opened the beat-up door of his Mercedes, he realized he didn't care. He'd go home, pack a few things, and then he'd be on his way. To what, he didn't know, but he wasn't going to find out alone. Becca pulled up in front of the huge stone house, her throat aching with unshed tears and her bladder close to bursting. She'd left Wolf Creek without even packing anything, had just grabbed her car keys off the lopsided wooden key hanger one of her brothers had made years before in a middle school shop class, got into the Mini Cooper, and left. Granny Jones had stood at the porch rail to see her off, waving gaily, giving her a huge grin. She'd promised to tell Becca's parents what was going on. Now, she was home. Archer's car wasn't in the drive, and she was grateful. She burst into the house, heading for the powder room in the hall. Washing her hands, she hoped Archer wouldn't be home for a while. She had to figure out what to tell him. When she stepped out into the hall, the front door was just opening. It was Lavinia. Becca froze, but when Lavinia came through the doorway, she had to do a double take. The woman was completely makeup-free, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wisps of frosted blonde hair sticking out messily every which way. She had on jeans and purple flip-flops, of all things, with a pink t-shirt that said, Bahama Mama, and sported a gaudy purple parrot. She looked normal. Like Becca's mom. Or someone you would see shopping for groceries. Lavinia looked around wildly, her eyes widening when she saw Becca. Oh, thank goodness. You're here. Where's Archer? The older woman was pale and shaky, and Becca hurried to grab her arm. Come into the kitchen and sit down. You don't look well. I'm sure there are sodas in the fridge. Is he here? Have you seen him? Not yet, Becca said. I just got here myself. What's going on? I don't know, Lavinia wailed. I just tried to call him at the office, and that secretary of his said he quit this morning. He quit? Becca settled her mother-in-law at the kitchen table and went to the refrigerator for a Coke. She started to put the can on the table, but remembering that rich people probably didn't drink their carbonated beverages or anything else out of cans, she stopped and went to the cupboard for a glass. No, Lavinia stopped her. Coke tastes better out of a can. Becca got a glass of water for herself and sat down across from Lavinia. To her utter shock, her mother-in-law burst into tears. I've driven away my son. He's having a nervous breakdown. An early midlife crisis. He's going to pack up and move away, sell this house that's been in the family for generations. I'm never going to see my grandchild. I'm a horrible mother. Becca then found herself in the weird position of trying to comfort the woman who had destroyed her marriage. Archer loves you. I'm sure he'd never try to cut you out of his life. But I've done nothing but make him try to fit into the place I think he should. You should have stopped that years ago, Llewellyn. I tried to tell you. Jackie. How many times have I told you not to call me that? Lavinia wiped her tears away quickly, stood up, and spun around. The tall, broad-shouldered housekeeper stood in the doorway like a monolith, her hands planted firmly on her hips and a scowl on her face. Sorry. Lavinia. Jackie didn't look sorry. She looked fed up. But you've had this little rebellion coming for a long time. You've always been so focused on being high and mighty Mrs. Hayes that you forgot where you came from. Don't you dare bring this up in front of her. I should fire you once and for all. Actually, I already know, Becca put in. When Lavinia gave her a stunned, slightly fearful look, Becca went on. My Granny Jones used to go to church with your family. Lavinia dropped her head in her hands and groaned. See now? No more secrets, Jackie said smugly. And you know you can't fire me. I work for your son. Plus, even you wouldn't fire your own cousin. Becca felt like she was watching a tennis match. She was getting dizzy. Jackie was Lavinia's cousin? None of this matters now, Lavinia cried out miserably. My son hates me. He doesn't. Jackie's voice gentled, and she gathered Lavinia up in her arms, hugging her like a child. You're a pain in the behind, but your son could never hate you. She's right. I don't hate you, Mom. Archer stood in the doorway, looking happy and healthy, and not at all like he was on the verge of a breakdown. He was wearing worn jeans and a long-sleeved black t-shirt, and even though she was accustomed to seeing him in tailored business suits, Becca thought he looked good enough to eat. She ached to get up, to run into his arms, and maybe it made her selfish, but she wished Lavinia would go find somewhere else to cry and feel guilty. As if Jackie heard Becca's silent prayer, she took Lavinia's arm gently. Come back to my place and have a cup of coffee. Let these two work things out. You've done enough interfering, and you and I haven't sat down for a good long chat in years. Surprisingly, Lavinia listened to her. She only stopped at the door for a moment. I'm sorry, you too. I've been awful. I'll try harder. Still sniffling, she let Jackie lead her out. The other woman tossed them a wink and a happy grin. Did you get that confession on tape? She asked teasingly. Because I'm pretty sure you'll never get her to say that again. As soon as they heard the front door close behind the two women, Archer went to Becca and pulled her into his arms. She clung tightly to his waist, wrapping her arms around him like she'd never let him go. Please, Becca, he whispered. I know I'm bound to be a jerk sometimes, but please don't ever leave me again. I won't, she promised, her face pressed against his chest. She felt him kiss the top of her head and squeezed him harder. You really are a jerk, though. I know, he chuckled. But I'm going to have a lot of time on my hands to make it up to you. Did you really quit? She asked, pulling back to look into his face. She saw no regret there, only a boyish enthusiasm that charmed her. I did. He let out a full-throated peal of laughter, one that she'd never heard from him before. It pulled a smile out of her that quickly fell away when he continued. I left my cousin Derek in charge. That irresponsible, spoiled young man has the whole company in his greedy little hands. No. He's going to wreck everything you and your father built. Nope, Archer grinned. For the first 5 years, he reports to one person. All decisions he makes must be run through his Aunt Lavinia for approval. She'll have an office next to his and a paid position within the company. If he makes it to the end of that 5 years without quitting, I'll know he's got the kind of backbone it takes to run Hayes Investments. It's a prolonged trial by dragon fire, so to speak. Becca laughed. You are purely diabolical. You've taken care of your greedy cousin and given your mom a major project all at once. But what are you going to do now? Archer's face softened as he looked down at his beautiful wife. That's something we'll decide together. I was thinking, since I've spent so many years building a fortune and making money, it's time I started spending it. But you have so much already. We do. But I don't mean that. Would you be interested in starting a charity? The Jones-Hayes Foundation? I mean, after our baby is born. Unless you just want to be a stay-at-home mom, and that's totally fine, too. I can't wait to be a father. Whatever you want. We'll do it together. This is a lot to take in, Becca said slowly, feeling dizzy again. This time it wasn't from Lavinia and Jackie's verbal sparring. She was literally feeling dizzy. Then, the room took one big lurch under her feet, and she reached out to grab hold of Archer's shirt to balance herself, but her fingers grasped only air as everything melted into blackness. For the first time, Archer got to see what his sweet wife was like when she was irritable. It was fascinating. Stop hovering, she snapped and then blushed. I'm sorry, but I seriously feel like I can't even breathe with you looming over me like that. Sit next to me. And hold my hand, please. Whatever you want, sweetheart. He grinned. Becca knew she was being unreasonable. Archer was just trying to help. But the doctor said she and the baby would both be fine if Becca put her feet up and got some rest for a week or so, taking care to keep her blood pressure where it should be. She hadn't been eating or sleeping right since she and Archer had their first fight, and it had finally taken a toll on her. But now, darn it, she was pregnant, icky feeling, and stuck in their bed for the next 6 days. She didn't want to watch TV, she didn't want to read, and she didn't know how she was going to stand it. She had a perfect right to be irritable if she wanted to be. Archer held one hand as she'd asked him to, but placed the other hand on Becca's belly. Did I tell you thank you for my surprise? He asked softly. You did, she assured him, 4 times on our way home from the hospital. 2 more before you carried me into the house and up the stairs. I've lost count of how many times since then. Well, get used to it. I'm going to be thanking you for the rest of my life. As long as you get used to my mood swings. Granny Jones said my mama almost scared my daddy right out of the house all 3 times she was carrying. Archer gave her a fake shudder, but his eyes twinkled. That's okay. If things get bad enough, I'll just move in with Jackie for a while. You'll be living there alone, Becca said. Jackie says she's moving in here to be our nanny. Between her and the baby, I think we'll still have 85 rooms to fill. Then, we'll just have to fill them and build an addition. Archer threaded his fingers through Becca's and picked up her hand. He kissed her knuckles. I love you, Rebecca Hayes. When Dr. Lachele matched us up, I didn't get what I asked for. I got more than I asked for. A wife, a lover, and a partner for life. I love you, too, Archer Hayes. For better or for worse. Oh, crud, she added, her eyes filled with tears that quickly overflowed, and she used her other hand to wipe them away. Mood swing incoming. He just laughed and kissed her tears away.